7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program. I am your host, Chris George Zuger, and you have entered the Den of Lore 100th episode. all the testing in the world, still technical difficulties to overcome, and overcome them we will, because that is the name of the game with this program. Episode 101, that'll be fine. New haircut, new music, and a great attitude. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We have made it. We have survived. And I want to say thank you very much to everyone out there who has been with us since the beginning. Because here in the Den of Lore, this is how we do it. And I'm... even with the switching back and forth, my automatic switching still didn't work, but that's okay. Special thank you to our patrons who have ensured that at least the sound is fantastic. And apparently I am still getting the hang of this. You know, I practiced this all week. And I swear, even with that, it's still mounted to next week. That'll be fine. Ladies and gentlemen, if it weren't for our patrons, we wouldn't be able to bring the show to you every single week. And you know what? I actually have the list somewhere. And I want to make sure I can thank every single one of you because, well, if it weren't for you guys, this show would not happen. We wouldn't be able to bring you the guests that we bring, say what we want, without recriminations from sponsors or corporations. And we are 100% funded by you, so we're accountable to you. And if it weren't for our illustrious masters, Pat from Brooklyn, and our masters, Jackie from across the pond, Eric, Rocky, Abdulrahman, Kevin, Jenny, Dobromir, Lee, Chuck Schwartz, Jared, Mrs. Fox, Joshua, Wayne, and our den mother, Ellen, as well as to the rest of our patrons, our FELLOWCRAFT, Lynne, Kathleen, Audrey, Eclipse, Photopic, Nick, Koray, Vanese, Charles, Hobby, T-Hot, our entered apprentices, Mark and Mike, and our patrons, Dennis, Eric O, Katie, Christopher M, and Robin. And I know that I'm probably missing a few who have joined over the last day or so, or even within the last hour or so. I will make sure that I can get to you and thank you personally on Patreon, or even email, or just add me to Facebook yourselves. So, ladies and gentlemen, on tonight's program, as you've noticed, you can see right up here, it says, this is the Younger DRYAS Impact 2018 New Revelations. And I want to be able to thank our guests, and I'm going to bring them on the show right now. Mr. George Howard, whom is, Randall, as well as I think Randall's with us as well, but I think he's screen sharing at the moment. So, George, you are in the hot seat currently, and I know that Randall is with us as well. And I'm just going to close that, see if that window's there. Nope, that is on Randall's side. George, how you doing? It's been almost a year since you were on the show last.
Yeah, I believe it was August 10th of last year, so yeah, we're just short, about 11 months.
And I have to say that scotch that you sent me was absolutely delicious, and I wanted to thank you in person for that very lovely and wonderful gesture. Any man who enjoys a good dram is somebody that I will definitely have to hold in very high regard.
Well, you're entirely welcome, Chris, and I look forward to being back on the show this evening.
And again, also, thank you also to Bram, our new co-host. I had to rope him in. I had to cajole him, wrangle him, twist his arm even. And
I'm still healing from that, by the way.
You're still... Oh, Bram, if you want to be able to say hello, Bram, you're in the Den 2.5 out in the southern wilds of Ontario. So you are a Canuck as well. I love the glasses. It's fantastic.
I feel like that, eh?
So
yep.
He's going to be running the hot...
It was hot as heck down here, let me tell you.
Hot as heck. Now, you are going to notice a few things because starting with episode 100, this is a new attitude, a new direction, a new... joie de vivre, as it were. And there will be no swearing on this program, and that is with respect to the younger viewers who want to be able to listen in. I know that some people want their kids to learn some cool shit, and that will be the only swear word you'll hear, and it's only with our tagline.
You can say that on CBC. You can say shit on CBC.
We can't say it 4 times in a row, so only once and only after 10 o'clock, and we're not there yet. And also joining us is the illustrious and a brother of mine from another mother, Mr. Randall Carlson. Randall, welcome back to the Den. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you as well. And again, thank you very much for your help last year and Sacred Geometry International's assistance with the fundraiser for John Anthony West. Yesterday was his birthday, and again, I wanted to be able to at least take this moment to say, brethren, raise your glasses to the man and just take a good swig for Jaws, if you will. Now, one thing we're not changing with the show is there is no opening. The opening segment is me thanking you guys. So I'm going to kick things off with Bram. I'm going to let him ask the first question as far as the icebreaker is concerned. He's new. We'll see how this goes. Trial by fire. Bram, take it away. Bram, can you hear me? How did we lose Bram? My goodness. Okay. Well, gentlemen, at least I can say this. No, I did not cut his audio. So, ladies and gentlemen, cool your jets. Over the last, we're in the 7th month, I'm going to say the last year, there have been a lot of developments within the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And obviously there has been a large movement away from it just being a theory to being more of an accepted possibility. And this is obviously to the dedicated work and toil to gentlemen such as yourself, George Howard, and as well as the rest of the individuals that you've worked with the Comet Impact Group, and Randall Carlson as well, due to his fearlessness of being in front of a camera and appearing on Joe Rogan Experience on numerous occasions. How have things progressed over the last 12 months as far as the accepted, I'm going to say the accepted alternative aspect? What has changed? What is new so far?
I'll take a lead on it, Chris, if you don't mind, because I've got a pretty good one.
Go right ahead, George.
Yeah, since we spoke last, and again, that was last August, we had a very, very comprehensive set of papers published, the Younger Dryas Impact team, and published in the Journal of Geology February 1st that was probably some of the best work that the team's produced. And I want to make sure right off the bat that I put out a little disclaimer that I'm not speaking for the co-authors on that paper. I think on that one, there's some 30 of us, and I'm certainly not going to speak for 30 people, nor am I going to speak for the larger research team, which includes close to 63. I can speak to my experiences with the team and my understanding of the science behind it and my understanding of the work that's gone behind what's been produced. But I just want to note that I can't, I'm not speaking for the team, and a lot of my speculation does not equal their speculation, and a lot of their evidence doesn't equal, my interpretation. So just wanted to make that disclaimer. But on February 1st, 2018, we published a couple of great papers in the Journal of Geology, very respected, America's oldest geology scientific journal. They were named, there was a part 1 and a part 2. It was so comprehensive that extraordinary biomass burning episode and impact winter triggered by the Younger Dryas cosmic impact approximately 12,800 years ago. Part 1 of that being ice cores and glaciers, where the forensic evidence was taken from ice cores and glaciers. And the second part of the paper, an entirely second paper, really published separately in the same journal, that was extraordinary biomass burning impact winter triggered by the Younger Dryas cosmic impact, lake, marine, and terrestrial sediments. Okay, looking for charcoal records essentially in lake and marine and terrestrial sediments. The terrestrial sediments we are pretty familiar with, the black mat, but a lot more work done on lake charcoal records and the timing of those records in the last 20 or 25,000 years, and how they tended to cluster if particular statistical approaches were used right around the date that we've been publishing on for 10 years.
Now, I'm sorry to interrupt. Now, I know that the new information started trickling out as early as Christmas time last year. And I noticed when the new paper was released that there was, let's just say, I'm banned from a lot of subreddits on Reddit now due to being a free-minded individual who speaks his mind, archaeology being one of them. I think even science at this point as well. The reception on the science subreddit was resoundingly positive from all aspects of whether it is your frontline researchers and scientists to just from your average layperson. They swamped that particular thread with positive accolades of it finally being accepted and actually being released as a peer-reviewed paper. what positive, reception or words have you received from mainstream, at least from the mainstream academia that had up until that point rejected outright the claims?
Yeah, I don't think there's been any explicit endorsements that have been made public. From what I understand in the communications that we keep among the co-authors of the papers, that anecdotally, and that's the best we can do now, that within research circles, that this has become increasingly accepted, and the evidence is beginning to take on a sense of overwhelming. But at some point, you can't dismiss it, and people I think are starting to read the papers. Just in my own, ResearchGate, which is one of the academic paper sharing services, my gosh, I'm getting more reads than I've ever had from people all over the world and sending notes from time to time. I think I've gotten well over 2,000, which is unusually large for that, and I've put several papers out there. But the anecdotal evidence certainly, and that's speaking to Dr. West and Dr. Kennett and Dr. Bunch and others who keep in touch regularly with other research labs, is that people are coming around to this, and that has a lot to do with Dr. Moore's paper of I believe it was 2017. But was it the platinum paper that found abundant platinum and very distinct spikes on several different continents worldwide? And then to follow it up with Wolbach et al., which you can find at the Cosmic Tusk, my blog. And those are the two papers, Wolbach et al., the Extraordinary Biomass Burning and Impact Winter papers. So there's a lot of chatter out there. I think it's positive, but until the worm turns, we're not going to hear it in the mainstream media. But it is in the journals, and we've long been able to publish in the journals, and that's a big, big win right there for what was once considered a very, very controversial hypothesis.
Now, I know, Randall, I originally got on the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis from your, I'm going to say it was probably the first podcast you did with Darren and Graham of Grimerica, whom kind of inspired this show. And I probably listened to that podcast to death. And some people have probably heard your origins of how you first came across this phenomenon. But I just love hearing the story again. So if you can catch some of the individuals up in our audience who may not have heard of you, and I can't be surprised if I could be surprised if they haven't, exactly how you stumbled across this as a theory. Randall, I think we lost your audio. Oh my goodness. Okay. Oh, we're gonna do this the fun way. Let's see here. Okay, I got you. Let me see if I can. Okay, Randall, if you want to go to the gear in the top right hand corner, and then click that, and then see if you've got a. You should have a video and a microphone and an audio or speakers, and make sure that for microphone your Logitech is chosen. But he can hear me fine, so I'm just going to call him up, and then we're going to do this the fun way. And hopefully, call it's mobile, copy. It's good, and
that's a shame. It was working just a moment ago.
It was working just a moment ago.
Yeah.
Gotta love that. It's always this fun. We've been having this fun, ever since we all got online. So I'm just going to.
Yeah, it's been a rather star-crossed night.
There we go. I got my. This is when your Koray goes to ground. Make sure there's no ground for your Koray to go to. Hello, Randall. Can you hear me?
Hey.
Hi. So I'm not sure what's going on with your audio, but I have no problems holding this phone to my microphone all night if necessary, so we can hear your wonderful voice.
Okay, now can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, well, it's too bad my microphone, or I don't know if it's the microphone. It shouldn't be the microphone. I think this is a brand new headset, so anyways, the question was, how did I get interested in the Younger Dryas boundary?
Correct.
Okay, well, I'm not sure really at what
Oh, did that drop? No. Oh, for crying out loud. 1 second. George, I'm going to add him onto the call here. Cancel. Add people. Yeah. There we go. He's... Oh. No, I don't want to add Phil, even though he'd love this. This is the fun part. So now what we're doing is he's going to be, Randall's currently on Google Hangouts, and I'm actually using Skype, which we could not get his microphone to work, to actually run the audio part of this, so this will be fun. So now he should be able to hear me.
Hello?
Yeah, hello, there we go. So I patched you in through Skype, and your video is running through Hangouts. But we have...
Okay.
Technology...
Now I'm on my cell phone. I was on my landline. Okay. So where were we?
You had started to begin to tell the story of how you had actually come across the younger DRYAS impact hypothesis.
Oh, the impact hypothesis, I guess I first heard about the impact hypothesis when Firestone's paper came out in 2007. But the reason I basically picked up on it as soon as it came out is because I've been following the literature and had been very much interested in the whole transition from the Pleistocene epoch to the Holocene, and all the events surrounding that, which included the mass extinction episode of the megafauna, the rapid melting of the ice sheets, the rapid extreme climate changes, and the whole question basically that had been on my mind for a couple of decades was what could possibly cause that. And I think it probably came in the wake of the 1980 revelations regarding the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary and the extinction of the dinosaurs and the other creatures of the late Cretaceous being caused by the impact of a bolide being, an object from space. And I was pretty electrified when that idea came out and pretty much followed it and followed the research on impact that really accelerated after that 1980 paper by Walter Alvarez and his colleagues, where they had discovered the iridium layer at the KT boundary, as it is called. So I began following all of the research into the rapidly accelerating research into cosmic impact phenomena, the studies on comets and asteroids and what we were learning about all of that. And then with the confirmation of an impact in the early 90s with the discovery of the Chicxulub crater on the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. And at some point, as I also was following the research regarding the climate changes that occurred, the early 90s is when we really began to get the high accuracy ice core records, particularly from GRIP and GIST, the Greenland ice sheet projects, where an American team and a European team went in and drilled to bedrock and discovered these extraordinarily fast and extreme climate changes, and particularly bracketing the whole Pleistocene Holocene transition. So it just became the question of, what is the trigger for that? And, between my interest in stuff from space, it just seemed like a logical fit. So I think that I wrote a paper that I used in my geology class that I was taking in the early 90s. And in that paper, I was proposing the idea that perhaps the rapid ice sheet melting and the mass extinction might have been related to some type of an impact. And then there was the work of, who could I even begin to list the people whose work informed my studies? The neocatastrophist school out of Britain, probably the prime expositor of that being Victor Klube, but Bill Napier. I think, isn't he he's in the Comet research team, isn't he, George?
He is, and he made a significant contribution to the Wolbeck et al. Papers with the astronomical hypothesis that can also be found on my blog. It's a wonderful read. Yep, he sure is.
Yeah, it's a great read. And the whole idea that he brought in with the Taurid meteor shower, I read what's called a book. It was Victor Klube, and I think he was co-author, and it came out in 1980 called The Cosmic Serpent. And that was one of the books that I read that really made me start thinking that cosmic impacts were a much more important factor in Earth's history than conventional thinking was acknowledging. So it just seemed kind of like a natural fit that, we had some extreme events that happened, between 12 and 13,000 years ago, roughly, bracketing the transition from the Ice Age, which was the late Pleistocene, in North America referred to as the late Wisconsin Ice Age, into the interglacial age that we're in now, and the inexplicably rapid and extreme changes that accompanied that just didn't seem, it seemed to beg some type of a larger explanation. And so, I began thinking about that. I gave a series of lectures at Warren Wilson College in North Carolina in 1996, where I talked about as a possible impact scenario related to the mass extinctions and to the rapid melting of the ice. And this was another factor that I felt was really the certain key features of the melting of the great ice sheets at the end of the last ice age was being overlooked. And so I've spent a lot of time over the last 22 years, roughly, exploring landscapes of catastrophe, which is basically looking at evidence for, this would be impact sites. I visited about maybe 20, close to 24 impact sites around North America, and also areas that have been subject to this extreme flooding from the melting of the ice sheets. And it's my opinion that the mainstream view of this melting phenomenon has not really addressed some of the bigger issues yet. And what I have seen is that it seems like you've got a lot of people exploring different aspects of this, as I call it, the meltdown, the great meltdown, but nobody really seems to be putting all the pieces together to get the big picture. So that's where I felt like, well, here I could make a contribution. So I'm going to try to bring in all of these factors, so I've been looking at, basically traveled along the southern margin of the ice sheet, looking at the big meltwater evidence coming off the ice sheets. And here's what's interesting. You would think that ordinarily ice sheet melting would be from the margin of the ice sheet back. I mean, when we see glaciers melting in the last couple of 100 years since the termination of the Little Ice Age, what we basically see is that the glaciers recede from their terminus or their margin, and they essentially shrink back. Well, you would think that you would see such a phenomena with really on a large scale with the melting of the great ice complex over North America or over Europe. That's not really what we see. When we look at it, what we see that there are melting epicenters that are well up within the ice sheet itself. In some cases, 1,000 miles, 500 to 1,000 miles back from the margin of the ice sheet. And I don't see any really explanation for how you could come up with melting epicenters far removed from the ice sheets, the margin of the ice sheets, short of something like an impact onto the ice sheet. So that was an idea that began to intrigue me, some 20 years ago, I guess, the possibility that the ice sheet was struck one or more times by the debris of a fragmenting bolide or comet. And everything I've learned in the interim is pretty much nothing has really served to discount that idea. And we can pull up some images here in a bit, and I'll show you some things that I think possibly are impact sites. And George can certainly verify this, that one of the big criticisms of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is the lack of a supposed impact crater. But what we have to bear in mind is if the impacts were into the ice sheet itself, in some cases, that ice is going to be 1 mile to 2 miles thick, and that ice is going to absorb a lot of that kinetic punch. And also, it's going to cause melting of the ice that is going to rapidly obscure what you would think of as a normal classical crater. And so I think that we have to kind of relook at some of the landscape features within the vicinity of the Great Ice Sheet Complex, with the idea in mind that they might be ultimately produced by impacts into the ice sheet. And so what I've done in order to try to understand that is I've looked at what the studies of what happens with an impact into an oceanic environment. And there is a transient crater that's produced, and there's a surge of water that goes out, and then there's a resurge wave that comes back in that collapses into the void where the impact actually occurred. And that resurge wave is going, especially in the oceans, it carries an enormous amount of sediment that then goes in and can almost fill the crater that would be produced in the ocean bottom. So I think we have to kind of look at the same kind of thing, possibly, at the base of the ice sheet, that if you had an impact into an ice sheet, you're going to have a lot of melting, and that melting is going to be, it's going to go over the top of the ice sheet, it's going to go on the bottom of the ice sheet, it's probably going to go within the ice sheet, because at the same time you have melting, you're also going to have a considerable amount of fracturing of the ice that's going to allow water under tremendous pressure to reach the base of the ice sheet. And so one of the things I've been looking at in the landscape is the formation of drumlins, which are, and I want to mention, George and I had one of our heroes was John Shaw, who did this tremendous work on reinterpreting drumlin features, and he just recently passed away, just a few months ago, right, George?
That's right. We contacted his wife trying to maybe go up there and see him. He'd welcomed us up there to go see him in Ontario early this spring, and I got back with him about a month and a half ago and said we'd be interested in coming up maybe later in the summer. And I was sad to see that his wife, Mrs. Shaw, answered us back and said that he had just passed. But he was surprisingly unaware in our limited exchange of some of the more recent science. He hadn't read Wolbach et al., and he was just excited as he could be, when I sent him those papers to say, well, this stuff looks like, fascinating read for a fellow like me. I've been talking about it for 40 years. And he was clearly, well into retirement. Possibly he was ill, but he was well aware of our interest and was excited to see us come up, Randall, and it's a darn shame we weren't able to do it. And I just recommend, John Shaw's papers on, glacial meltwater and outflow as highly as I could to anybody that's interested in that obscure part of science.
Now,
I had the opportunity last fall to spend 4 days up in the field in British Columbia with Jerome Lessman, who was a student of John Shaw and a co-author with him of that very important 2000 paper on the floods, where it's saying the Channel Scabland, titled "The Channel Scabland Back to Bratz," and that was I consider that to be a milestone paper, because for the first time you have somebody with a degree of credibility challenging the standard model of what produced the great floods that swept over eastern Washington state, and that there may have been multiple sources of water other than a large proglacial lake in western Montana. So, I mean, this is something that the whole question of that issue gets really complicated, and I don't know what level of detail really we should get into that.
As much as you want.
But, there's a kind of a standard model that the flood was caused by a proglacial lake held in by an ice dam. The ice dam gave way. The lake drained out from western Montana, swept across southeastern Washington, down the Columbia, through the gorge, and into the Pacific Ocean.
That's right.
Well, that wave would have gone right across the Atlantic Ocean, and it would have impacted parts of Africa, and that kind of perturbation of water, it'll just keep going until it hits something. So it could have been the flood mist that have been around the world.
Well, bear in mind, okay, in terms of the Missoula floods in the Channel Scabland, all of that was directed to the Pacific. However, the melting of the Great Ice Complex, you had tremendous floods coming down the Mississippi Valley. You had tremendous floods issuing out of the St. Lawrence River Valley into the Atlantic. You had gigantic floods emanating from the ice sheet on the northern perimeter of the ice sheet that have left their traces in the Mackenzie.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the whole ice sheet was undergoing this tremendous meltdown, and it was feeding into the Pacific, feeding into the Gulf of Mexico, into the Atlantic, and into the Arctic Ocean, all simultaneously. And at the same time, or again, possibly at the same time, more detailed chronologies need to be worked out, but the Fennoscandian ice sheet, which was a good 1.5 million cubic square miles of ice over northwestern Europe, also underwent a meltdown. So yeah, there was an enormous amount of ice. I mean, I think I've seen that volume of ice estimated at 6 to 7 million cubic miles, which is basically double the amount of ice that we now have in Antarctica and Greenland. And that ice sheet underwent a meltdown through several stages, of course. And at the beginning of this process, sea levels were about 400 feet lower than now, which means that most of the continental shelves surrounding the continents were exposed to the atmosphere and were actually, had whole ecologies, forests off the eastern coast of the United States that were growing in some cases 50 miles further out now than the coastline is. So with the rapid melting of the ice sheets, which appears to have occurred in, like I said, in various stages, perhaps 3 great stages of rapid melting. At the Younger Dryas, it actually appears that the melting stopped altogether, and there maybe was even a reversal, and the ice sheets began to expand again for about 1,300 years. And then the Younger Dryas boundary, which is dated at about 12,800 years, plus or minus a few decades, that Younger Dryas came to an end at 11,600 with another episode of extreme warming. So yeah, you had this rise of sea level globally of 400 feet from the late glacial maximum into the early Holocene. And that certainly wiped out and drowned large swaths of land that would have been the prime habitable real estate during the Ice Age. So, so that brings up the whole question of, what may have existed. And I've said for years, I think that maybe that there's really a big future in archaeology as far as the marine archaeological explorations. So I certainly think that this could be related to the worldwide flood myths. Whether you're a coastal community and your sea level is rising rapidly, or you're along a river valley and suddenly there's these gigantic floods coming through the river valley that pretty much wipe everything out, or it would follow that an impact into an ice sheet, just like into an ocean, would loft tremendous amounts of water vapor into the atmosphere that would then rain out, causing extreme meteorological events that could cause secondary flooding in areas that weren't being directly affected by meltwater.
I think that's something that some engineer or some kind of climatologist has got to unpack. They've got to experiment on that. What they've got to do is simulate what would happen if a massive impactor was to hit not Earth, not water, but a huge sheet of ice. What would happen to that? Has anybody done anything like that?
Yeah, they sure have.
Not really. That's why.
Bram actually did.
Oh, well, George, you might.
They did? Oh,
yeah,
cool.
Pete Schultz with the high-speed gun out of the, I believe it's the Ames Research Laboratory in California, has taken sheets of ice and, with NASA funding and a NASA lab, and exploded the pellets that they use to simulate impactors into the smaller ice sheet, and you can see that on YouTube, and it does what you think it would do. It distributes the kinetic energy of the impactor across the ice surface so that it is less distinct below the ice. It blows away the ice, but doesn't leave a typical crater, because obviously a lot of the energy's been
laterally
taken
turned
by
out.
the substrate that it impacted.
Now, let me try and reframe this at least for a moment and get the large elephant out of the room, because I know the last time I had both Randall as well as Dr. Robert Schock on the show at the same time, there is some, I'm going to say, contrast between the possibility of being a coronal mass ejection versus an actual impact that caused the destruction 12,900 some years ago. I know that recently he was on Joe Rogan Experience, which Randall, you know Joe pretty well, and he actually admitted that, or at least I'm going to say admitted, he had postulated the idea that it is a possibility that there could have been a coronal mass ejection after the meteor impact, or at least the comet impact, and that the comet could have actually caused the sun to react via some type of electromagnetic interaction to then eject a large flare, or at least a part of its mass, towards the Earth. Now, knowing that this is at least being discussed, and I'd like to think that Dr. Robert Schoch is a fairly reputable individual, like all of you gentlemen as well. Have you looked into this yourself, Randall?
Not to the extent that I intend to. I have a great deal of respect for Robert Schoch, and I don't discount that idea at all. I at this point, I would say, well, I think that the comet impact hypothesis is very robust. If I had the same confidence in the coronal mass ejection idea, I would probably say this, that, the transition that we're talking about was about a 3,000 to 4,000 year process, right? Okay, within that 3,000 to 4,000 years, I think that possibly we are looking at kind of a perfect storm of things that happened. I don't reject the coronal mass ejection hypothesis, and because I haven't really looked into it to the depth that I have looked into some of the other aspects of this. So I'm totally open to the idea. And I'm not going to say it's got to be an either or thing. I would like to, really get down and get the details, more background before I even venture an opinion on the validity of the or credibility of the CRE, CME. But hey, possibly, if such a thing is possible and it can drastically affect the Earth, then yeah, it could make sense. I do think, though, that the impact hypothesis really is quite robust. So I don't think that by saying or acknowledging the possibility of a coronal mass ejection negates the possibility or probability of an impact. And how the two could be related might be interesting. I mean, it could be we're looking at something here that really is much broader than just the Earth. We might be looking at something here that involves, even the entire solar system.
Before
because we're still far from having the final story on what happened.
That's right.
That's my opinion. I mean,
for Chris, Randall, and Bram, I think it's interesting to point out the original author of the original paper of our research group, Dr. Richard Firestone, the 2007 paper that I guess one day will be referred to as the seminal paper to the research. Firestone has always maintained personally that it was a coronal mass ejection or, some type of high energy particle event. And despite the papers that had his lead name on it reaching a different conclusion that shows the intellectual honesty of the Comet Research Group and the intellectual diversity that Firestone maintains, that Schultz could be right about that. But the rest of the group and the forensic evidence that we developed subsequently to that pointed more to a high energy event that involved terrestrial rock that was vaporized. And it's very hard for a coronal mass ejection to vaporize, terrestrial bedrock into little tiny microscopic droplets. It's just, that's not what you expect from that. You're going to expect a lot of radiation. You may expect heat. You may expect, auroral effects and high energy effects, but it's not going to vaporize rock into little bits. So the forensic evidence kind of points against it, but you've got to be open-minded in this field of research, that's for sure. And there's a lot of diversity in what we think happened. That doesn't change that it seems to be such a sudden event that it was an event of a sudden nature that caused it, that it was not a slow change as was long suspected, but something that might have happened in just a day.
I got a question I'd like to throw out there. Earlier on, just before I lost my sound, I wanted to ask you a question about the younger DRYAS black mats. And I think that's what you're alluding to right here. Could you take a moment and unpack that for us?
Yeah, well, it's important to note that, the black mat, as I said on a podcast I was on not long ago, pointed out that the black mat itself is not chock-a-block full. It is not black because there is cosmic or burned material in it from the impact, okay? It's common misunderstanding, totally justifiable. But the black mat, we believe, is actually more of a relic terrestrial environmental effect of the post-disaster days in the climate change, particularly in the southwestern United States, where you might have had lower evapotranspiration in a cooler, wetter period, where you would have developed more kind of an algal ecosystem over a period of several hundred years that would leave a signature black mat, just as a lot of wetlands do in environments around the world. But where we find the interesting materials and where the forensic evidence points to a highly, greatly heated rock and mineral evidence is right below the black mat, Bram. So the black mat is a marker where to look for the more exotic materials that are located right below it. And I'm happy to show you a picture from C. Vance Haynes's paper, pointing out that Rancho Labran, as he puts them, which is another term for this period in history, black mats, relatively, somewhere around 12, 13,000 years ago, cover, I think, 80% of the archaeological sites that they find during the Clovis period that he spent his career studying. Now, Haynes, I would think, is best characterized as somewhat on the fence of this and open-minded. He's well into his 80s. I think this hypothesis was, probably quite a surprise to him, but he certainly welcomed, our research team onto his sites to take a look, and then subsequently published a paper that said, yeah, they're right. There's a black mat at most of the sites I've studied in my career and most of the sites that others have studied in North America. And it needs to be explained, and it probably happened very suddenly, and it happened in a manner that we have yet to explain, that he says in the conclusion of the paper, leaving it an open question. When you go look at that black mat and you test, again, directly below it in the stratigraphy, that's where you find the exotic materials. And the platinum particularly that we have refined. There were also some indications of iridium peaks as well, but iridium's a much more squirrely element to test for, apparently, iridium. And also very expensive. But then we found that platinum was highly elevated, I think across 4 or 5 continents at that same area in the stratigraphy.
What's the
Does that help, Bram?
Oh yeah, definitely. That's really cool. I mean, like it's getting my metallurgy mind going, because I'm asking Emma one second, what isotope of platinum is it? Is it terrestrial, non-terrestrial? But I want to just come back from that a little bit. We've got a question in the chat here from Dean. And he's asking about the climate events that have happened. He says he asked him about the even bigger temperature fluctuations during the last ice age, pre-13,000 years ago, and ask your guests, what do you think caused those? They make the 12K years ago and 11,500 years ago temperature change look like blips. Is that anything you can speak to, or is that out of your wheelhouse?
Well, I think that the answer to that is no one has figured it out yet.
That's a good answer.
Yeah, there have been extreme climate changes. And we're basically just deciphering the most recent extreme climate change. We're talking, 7 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit in, sort of an average temperature to get us out of the ice age. In some cases, regionally more extreme than that. But, I don't think that anybody really can say with certainty what's driving these tremendous climate changes that we see in the Greenland ice core records and some of the other ice core records. Yeah, I mean, they are extreme.
Well, there's a reason why the Younger Dryas has been studied for 50 years. It is a very extreme event, but it also coincides with some things that the other climate crashes didn't, and that was a large extinction of mammals, and obviously, along with a dramatic change in temperature. So something fairly unique happened to the, biology of the planet in addition to the temperature. But I believe that, there are dramatic swings, particularly if you look at larger time frames. For that period, it's difficult to find, back to the late glacial maximum and previous glaciations, I believe drops that were as sudden, literally, as, obviously your resolution drops as you go further back in time, and we know, resolved this quite well, even gotten it down. I think some of the late varves in Germany indicate that it happened around June. on particular dates that they can't put it to, but they can actually see the seasonality of when the temperature changed. And there's nothing in the past that's that refined. Yes, there were obviously great, climate changes, but this one has a certain suddenness that seems to be unique, at least among the recent changes.
Now, and it also, like George just said, the mass extinction episode that occurred along with the climate changes makes it unique. The rapid melting of the ice sheets tends to make it unique. So, yeah, I think that in part of I think what's going on here is we're realizing that the history of this planet we live on is a lot more catastrophic than we recognized a few decades ago even. And what happens is you have a catastrophe and it leaves a major imprint in the landscape in various forms, from microscopic to macroscopic. But then the next catastrophe comes along and tends to obscure a lot of what happened earlier. So it's very difficult for us to look at what might have happened, 52,000 years ago when there was a major climate shift. Some of the researchers that are working on the Missoula flood and Channel Scablands have identified, major meltwater events, floods and so forth that came down through those areas literally like 50,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago. I forget the exact dates, but so it looks like there were earlier gigantic catastrophes, at least in terms of diluvial events, flood events, but they didn't necessarily cause a global mass extinction like we said. That's, to me, the thing that really... And then also the collapse of the Clovis culture that coincides with the mass extinction, with the climate change, and with the deposition of the various impact proxies. Can I try pulling up a screen share here?
You're more than welcome to. You're on the big screen, so you're good to go.
I'm going to go share screen. If it lets me do this, try your screen.
While you're working on that, Randall, let me point out one other thing, kind of unique. I can't give you the explanation, and it's one of the great mysteries of climatology, I suppose, paleoclimatology, is that one thing unique about the Younger Dryas and the big dip that we had then was it stopped. It was the last one. When you look back in the record, it's very, very consistent since then. But it was chaotic, terribly chaotic, with horrible, horrible dips and rises in temperature. And then after the Younger Dryas event, when we pop out of it 1,200 years later, you have a very regular climate that has obviously assisted our, development as civilized, intelligent beings.
And you have to think back. I'm sorry to interrupt you. You have to think back to, okay, well, and I'll use Graham's term, being a species with amnesia. You have to think back about what possibly was there then, and I'm not thinking necessarily people flying around in crystal spaceships, but there's a certain level of advancement that we may have had at that point in time, which obviously has been demonstrated through various artifacts or maps, which we don't have much of an explanation for. But again, I digress.
Well,
personally, I love
to
the
that.
idea
I would say, as far as what might have been going on culturally or in terms of civilization. See, here's the thing: it's the events of the Younger Dryas and the events of the transition between the Pleistocene and Holocene were so extreme, and the geomorphic rearrangement of large areas of the Earth was so extreme that it would be expected that whatever was going on prior to that would now be extremely obscure and difficult to discern. But as far as people will criticize and say, well, we know there were no advanced civilizations, and I don't can't speak for Graham, but from my own perspective, what I would surmise is that an advanced civilization may mean something along the lines of the Phoenicians or the Minoans, a culture that had well-developed navigational skills, astronomical skills that would go along with navigational skills, and basically a maritime culture that could have possibly been quasi-global in extent. I mean, we don't need to go and start talking about, airplanes and rocket ships and crystal technologies or any of that. I think we could just start for now with theorizing that there might have been a maritime civilization. And I think there is evidence that shows, sort of, I tend towards the diffusionist school. And it looks to me like a lot of the things that have gone on in history really are difficult to explain through like independent evolution. Particularly as a builder, I look at a lot of these episodes of this epic or monumental building. And what we find is that, if we go back to roughly 4,500 to 5,000 years ago, we find a major episode of monumental building around the world, almost as if somebody, blew a whistle and everybody picked up their trowels and went to work. We see, the first waves of major construction in Central America. We see the first monumental earthworks in North America. We see the first rising of cities in ziggurats in Samaria, the rise of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, the first temple construction in Southeast Asia. And it's quite a phenomenon itself. It's a mystery that's worth addressing. And, so it kind of raises the question. What Graham has said is interesting, where if we go back to recorded history, we think of that as the beginning of something, but he likes to frame it that it was actually the end of something, that there was something else that preceded it. And I think what we now know about the nature of global change, you see, a lot of these models of prehistory arose when there was a strict gradualism or a strict uniformity that ruled our thinking about ancient history, about prehistory. The idea that everything changed only one drop of water, one grain of sand at a time. And in that scenario, well, yeah, you wouldn't expect that, you might have a culture that could be utterly erased from the earth. But, we find even modern examples. If you recall have you ever heard of the Tambora eruption
yes,
along the Sunda Arc?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that erupted in 1815, and then the following year in the Northern Hemisphere was called the Year Without a Summer.
Mm-hmm.
But there were, in those islands of like Sumbawa, which was the island that Tambora was on, there were three long, well-established cultures, right, that had existed there for centuries and centuries. Literally in one day, those three cultures, their language, their ceremonies, their tradition, literally erased, completely gone in one day. Now, that's, of course, just a regional event, right? But when we're talking about the Younger Dryas, we're talking about a global event. And it could be that what was going on culturally just could not make it across that transition, just like woolly mammoths and mastodons and giant ground sloths couldn't make it across that transition. And what would you expect to see in the aftermath? If it was like if I was the scenario I was describing of a maritime culture, building their ships out of wood or out of reeds or however they might have done it, we obviously aren't going to find any of that anymore. If they had temples built of stone, what do we have? Well, that brings us back to John Anthony West in the Sphinx. Here's a Sphinx, a possible a sculpture carved out of bedrock itself would be the kind of thing that might survive an event like that. We know that there's numerous studies that show that there were extreme floods coming down the Nile River that would coincide precisely with the Younger Dryas. There were extreme floods. Like, there are places where there are deposits 120 to 150 feet above the modern Nile floodplain. If floods like that came through, whatever may have been there, that wasn't literally part of the bedrock itself, it's going to be gone. Even because, these floods that I go and I study, they will transport and move boulders that are the size of, Greyhound buses and bigger, right? So if you're building a temple, and even if it's a 200-ton block of stone, some of the kinds of floods we're talking about here, they're going to make short work of that. Literally. I don't know if you can you see my screen?
I can.
I pulled up a picture of the black mat. Is it visible? The one at Murray Springs, Clovis site?
Perfectly visible. It's front and center.
So the people listening in can actually kind of see what this one looks like. This one is at the Murray Springs, Clovis site, and it's a pretty prominent layer. And what George was saying, it in itself, it's not necessarily. It could be what it seems like, tell me if I'm saying this right, George, it looks like it was a very wet, moist climate for a short period of time, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
What we're seeing is almost like, and so we're almost seeing here like incipient piatification, and to me this would possibly make sense with an impact into an ice sheet, is that, you would have, for a period of time, you're going to have a lot of rainfall, and you're going to have a lot of saturated landscapes. So it kind of makes sense that you might have this formation of like this peat layer. And then, like George says, at the bottom of it is where you find the impact proxies.
And obviously between the black mat, pre-impact and pre-peatification, it seems like there's a drastic change in terms of the sediment in that area, which could be indicative of, well, as I said, it looks like night and day in terms of the difference between the two. So, what would be the cause of the drastic change of, that coloration? Like, is it climate change, or is it something more?
Yeah, it is climate change, and it's the change of the biology and the terrestrial fauna, flora, the plants that are growing there, and it's more of an algal situation. You end up with kind of a blue-green algae, just a gross, dead, wet, cold landscape for a long enough time so that it leaves a signal, in the stratigraphy. If you can switch over, Chris, if you can pick up my screen share, can you do that at this point?
I can. One moment. Let me just turn on studio mode and figure out exactly which.
This is the great Vance Haynes, who I mentioned earlier, who's really the preeminent Clovis archaeologist. The paper that he came out with shortly after we indicated there might have been a widespread catastrophe. And I would say kind of the subtext of his paper is perhaps he'd never really considered that. And then he addressed it, at least in the part that he said, well, let's see. Well, if I look across North America at sites that I have studied my entire career and my colleagues have studied, is there a ubiquitous black mat at this same time period? And that time period is defined by the end of the megafaunal bones. When they dig down, it was often an informal, it should be a very formal indicator now. The platinum that's contained just below the layer should be a formal indicator. It should be helpful to archaeologists. But in an informal way, it was helpful to them. They knew when they got to the black mat and got below it, they would begin to find the bones of the mammals that we no longer see today. The dire wolves, the cave bears, the North American giraffes, the giant ground sloths, and obviously the mammoths, the mastodons, all those
camels,
animals that just 13,000 years ago, all of their remains are found below that layer. And of course, all of the Clovis culture remains, the very first American lithic culture that had a similar arrowhead, if you will, from coast to coast and all the way down into South America. The last place you find, kind of the first and the last, because they were only around for several hundred years, is right below that black layer. So do you have my screen up now, Chris?
You are up and good to go.
Yeah, so let's flip through. This is supplemental information, which is always good when you're reading these scientific papers. If you can get past your eyes glazing over, it's good to read the paper, and oftentimes very fruitful to get into the supplementary information, because they'll pile in some more figures and fun stuff that they couldn't get the editors to take in the main body of the paper. So here we go. Look here. Look at that. So A is Murray Springs, who Randall just pointed out. Then the NACO Clovis site.
I just want to be able to interrupt you there.
Blackwater Draw, etc. So Lubbock Lake, Goshen, the Folsom Goshen Plainview and Agate Basin artifacts. Let's see, what site is that? Knife River Lake. Again, these are sites all around North America that show that same black mat, and those are all well-studied sites.
Now, I don't have
somebody whipping their camera out, but each of these are very detailed investigations where below that location, you see a young fellow there digging right below it.
Actually,
that's where they find the bones.
But I don't see the screen share, unfortunately, on this end.
Oh, do you not see any screen share?
No, I just have your lovely, lovely face.
Well, my gosh, I am sorry. Hold on.
Oh, it's good to look at. So we have a large female viewership. Just don't tell your wife that.
Okay, well, hold on just a second and we'll get it. Oh my gosh.
But you were able to see my image, right?
Yeah,
we got
you were
your-
golden.
No problem at all.
I probably have most of the ones that George has, or some of them.
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah. While you're doing it, Randall, call up C. Vance Haynes, Rancho La Brand.
His article?
Yeah.
Let's see here.
I don't mean to make you do a trick, but if you can, how do I screen
Oh,
right?
I think
Yeah, hold on.
what was that?
Okay, am I coming across now?
No, you were not.
Apologize to the viewers.
Well,
Share screen, I should be.
apparently in the chat I'm seeing that a new nickname for Randall is Golden Randall.
Golden Randall.
Golden
That's
Randall.
fitting. That's fitting.
What?
Hey, the viewership decides on these things. I have no say. There we go. I got you on that one. Oh,
Okay, are we seeing George yet?
we are seeing George.
Oh, we are.
Okay, let me.
But we can't see the screen share, correct?
I'm seeing your screen share. I'm seeing Bram and then my beer gut. There we go. That's perfect.
Can you
There we
see
go. I see it.
content
Yep.
paper now?
Yeah, we're good.
Yep.
And university, the papers there, as well as the charts.
Yeah, those are some great charts. That's from another one. I'm going to call up this other C. Vance Haynes. Very informal here on the dental lore, but I like that when I'm listening to podcasts. Okay, so if I've still got my screen share going, we should be right here, and you go down to supplementary info. What I was just trying to show, obviously, if you
Well, it's not.
distracted.
It's
So
not
those
a
photos
problem.
right there. Does that help out?
That helps out a great deal.
Yeah, so that's a number of different, the same black mat at a number of different locations in North America. Okay? Sometimes it's very, very distinct. Sometimes it's a little faded, but it's always jumps out versus the rest of the stratigraphy above and below it.
And this is found pretty well all over all over North America in certain areas. I know that it's found in Africa in certain areas, in Europe. Is it found in Asia as well as Australia?
No, and I don't think the African, there has been some indications in Africa, but it hasn't been directly studied related to our hypothesis.
Okay.
Now, it has in Europe, that is very distinct in Europe, and it's known as the Uselo layer, and you find it in Belgium and the Netherlands. In the cover sands there, you go down about a meter or two, and it's been known for, 100 years, possibly more, but definitely, published and in knowledge for decades that there was an extremely distinct layer, and I'll go take a look at that in a second. But just to take you on through this, see that?
Mm-hmm.
Look at that gentleman. See, and then all of those, again, that's not just roadside photos. All of those are well-studied, well-dated archaeological and paleontological sites in North America. And then if you go look, there you go. The black mat is located at each of those sites.
It's unfortunate. I think my area of Canada, which I think was, I'm going to say maybe around 700 to about 700 miles south of Area 31. I think that may have actually been under ice sheet at the time. So even though I've thought about maybe there's some black mat around here, like no, we have rock sediment going back about 200 million years, and then nothing until after the ice age ended.
And one thing that maybe I'll point out for the listeners that are new to it, and it'll often get confused even in popular articles written by science writers. They'll say that it's analogous, which it is analogous to the KT boundary, the dinosaur killer boundary, where they discovered a black mat, if you will, there. But that's actually that's in rock. That's where the the evidence has petrified completely into bedrock is where, those indications are found. That's 63 million years ago. That is far, far, far more distant than what happened here. It's entirely analogous, but what you're able to do here is you are able to see it in the soil. You're able to see it in, right below the topsoil, if you will, in some locations. And, that's unique. That indicates, obviously, that it's incredibly recent. And it's amazing to think that if you waited long enough, presumably, when that soil does turn into rock, in some cases, that you're going to find that same mat. So I've blown up the photo now, and you can see the archaeological sites. I think it's some 80 or 90 of them. And the ones that are circles that are not filled in, that look like a donut, is where they do not have indications of the black mat. And then the dark circles are where they are. And that's just an overwhelming set of features there.
That almost looks like an ejecta pattern.
Yeah, but
it's kind of
those
like arc, isn't
locations
it?
aren't being selected because of anything on the surface that would, be the result of an impact.
And also, gentlemen, we'll take another 5 minutes, and then we'll go to a 10-minute break so that everyone can take a little bit of a rest and recharge your glasses for the next segment. I know some of you have very much appreciated the new break segment, so I don't want to disappoint.
Well, maybe for the next segment, we'll have the technical glitches squeezed out.
Oh, we can try, and if not, then I'll just squeeze some of these these pythons right here.
Right.
Squeeze the python. The completely different meaning that I was thinking about squeezing the python.
This is a family show now, Bram. This is a family show.
Oh, sorry. That's my fault.
One thing I want to be able to at least, I'm going to at least pose this as a beginning to the next segment, and that's the interesting dichotomy there is between the scab lands on the west and the Carolina Bays in the east. And I know that there is a lot of, conjecture and hearsay that some people will say that is, although with recent findings that it came out last year with regards to the possible impact crater in, I believe it was Michigan, that the supposed, I'm going to say, pattern to some of these impacts, or at least bays as they have turned out to be, seem to be fairly analogous to an impact in that area. So, ruminate on that subject, gentlemen, as we finish up this segment. And for all of you out there in YouTube and Twitch, Periscope, and Spreaker, wow, we're in a lot of places now. And
I'm afraid I'm going to have to bow out because I've got to wake up at 6:30 in the morning.
Oh, you're leaving me all the fun.
I've got an install going on, so you have the con, sir.
I have the con. Engage number one. Bram, have yourself a good night. Well, I'll talk to you afterwards.
Indeed. Be well, sir.
Thank you, Bram.
Thank you, gentlemen. It was an excellent episode, and I'm really sorry I'm going to be missing the second half, but I will definitely be picking it up on all of the different outlets and on YouTube here. And for all those that are watching, don't forget to smack that like button and hit that bell. This is some good content. Good night, all.
All right, and
hanging out with you, Brian.
Fantastic. So, did you want to go directly to break for this one, George, or did you want to?
Whatever you like, host. I mean, I can talk a little Carolina Bays if you like. Am I still screen sharing?
You are. I'm on screen every single time you have me on screen. I just have to like suck in my gut a little bit. I have to make people think that I'm in better shape than I actually am. So let me bring this one back here. I'll go back to the big desk cam. All right, ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. We'll be talking Carolina Bays and continuing on the conversations, and hopefully we will have solved the technical difficulties. If not, we're just going to keep rolling with the punches, but we'll see what we can do on the break. And see you in about 10 minutes. Charge your glasses. I do recommend a good space side.
Myself again.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we are back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us back at the program. If you saw me pumping my hands in the air, it's because I didn't switch over to the break, the break screen, and at that point we'd actually gotten Randall's audio working, and well, I was quite excited about that. So, Randall, welcome back to the program. Not on cell phone. It's good to have you.
Yeah, I'm glad to have that cell phone off of my ear.
And obviously with the technical issues that is inherent with any podcast or any radio broadcast show, it's always good to be in the good company of good men to discuss very good subjects. And one good subject is the Carolina Bays. And I know it's a very controversial one.
Oh gosh, isn't it?
Who wanted to start off with this particular subject as far as what's known and what some of the misconceptions are?
George, I think this would be a good one for you to take, although I might
throw in a definitely my East Coast baby. I'll be very informal about it if I will. I think it's the only way to address it because it's such an absolute mess in so many ways. It's a fascinating subject, and I encourage any of your viewers to go out and Google Carolina Bays. Okay, and it's what got me started, in the subject, and it's just a brief explanation of what the geological phenomena is for those that aren't aware. The Carolina Bays are a set of approximately 55,000. We've got a pretty good count on them these days. A lot of people say 500,000, but we know now it's actually far less. It's about 55,000 visible, shallow, elliptical, oriented depressions along the Atlantic coastal plain in the shallow cover sands of the mid-Atlantic and even somewhat in the deep south in the Northeast. So kind of from Elizabeth, New Jersey on down to southern Georgia, and then some indications around from there. And then also found in Nebraska and Kansas, almost mirror-like reflection of the bays in the Midwest out there. They're oriented along their long axis in a similar direction that points to somewhere above the upper Midwest. And they have been speculated about since the 1930s when they were discovered. They are extremely subtle features that are glaringly obvious from above. So when one's on the ground, they're extremely subtle, and you could barely take notice of them. And map makers and early settlers, and even people well into the 20th century, never appreciated the regularity and ubiquity of the feature in the southeastern coastal plain, particularly until aerial photography came around in the 1930s. They pulled out the maps as a particular set of aerial photographs of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and they were absolutely amazed to see that these long elliptical features, stretched, oriented features, were found in those sandy coastal plain soils absolutely everywhere. Their highest concentration is in the Carolinas. That's why they're referred to as the Carolina Bays. They're called bays because they are almost universally associated with bay trees, which are aromatic trees, just like the bay leaves that you find in a nice spaghetti sauce, or you might buy in a herb jar, is that same leaf. And you can actually pluck those and put them in your spaghetti sauce if you wanted, right here in North Carolina. So that bay tree is found there, but of course that's terribly misleading because in some cases they are aquatic features. Some of them are lakes, very, very few of them, but those are very noticeable. So people get confused. Are we talking about a marine feature or a bay? They tend to be near the coast. No, it has nothing to do with the coastal geography. It has to do with the plant in them called bays. Okay, so why are they controversial? They're controversial because people have long suspected, both very serious scientists and almost universally, any layman that looks at the feature says, well, my gosh, those appear to be some kind of impact from above. It seems to be something that is splattered out across that landscape and caused those features. And that was a popular explanation in the 1930s. And I can take you through the whole pained debate, but I think it's very important to note here before I get into it that we do not consider as a group any longer, and in the publications, for them to be a significant part of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis that we've been speaking of. They did provide some of the forensic evidence, some of the materials evidence in the early paper. Some of that material continues to be included in papers today, but that is more of an indication of what could have occurred at the time rather than the feature itself being a result of geomorphological creation of the tremendous impact that we believed happened. Okay, there are others that still do believe that the Carolina Bays are directly related to the Younger Dryas impact. And those websites are easily found, and some of those people are my close friends and collaborators across the years. And I continue to believe that it's an open question whether the bays were created at the same time rather than is well documented in the literature and perhaps much better documented, surely better documented than the catastrophic explanation that, as is claimed by the mainstream, that they were created over time and during several different periods. If I can elaborate a bit on where I break away with the mainstream and where I still have problems with it, though I do not specifically ascribe it to the YD event, I believe it's an open question, could be, may not be. But I differ personally with the recent publications, particularly by Chris Moore, who's a wonderful fellow and a part of the Younger Dryas research team, is a probably over-published calling into question very expertly whether the Carolina Bays were associated with the event that he is also publishing on very controversially in favor of and in support of. So Chris Moore is one of several that publishes that, yes, something happened 13,000 years ago, and then he has a separate set of publications that says Carolina Bays are a very unusual but relatively easily explained terrestrial feature that is not unusual. They were not created simultaneously, and they're not created catastrophically. So it's an interesting divergence. And what happens is our critics, and it's particularly concerning to us, because you can't show that the Carolina Bays were related to it. And in fact, some of the best researchers we've got on the team publish, in opposition to a sudden causation for the Carolina Bays. It's kind of muddied the waters a bit. And if our opponents seize on the bays as being our best evidence or some critical part of the evidence for the YD event, to be right, very frank with you, it probably doesn't do us any good. That there's better evidence out there. Okay? But
I would say
I can't turn my back on the fact that I think that they are inadequately explained. And I'll give you an example. Chris Moore's most recent paper looking at Herndon Bay in North Carolina, and you could, Google Chris Moore, Carolina Bay, Herndon Bay. I could even go get it on a screen share if you like. Did a wonderful study, okay, and he did a lot of dating on it, etc. But really the premise of his theory of causation of the bays is the same one that was given, although there are a number of different versions, but the same one, he ties it to the same one that was given in 1977 by Ray Kaczorowski in a NASA-funded study that said that they were formed by wind blowing across an unconsolidated sediment, and low parts, kind of left unexplained what did create the initial depression, but after there's a depression and water gathers, that you get circular eddies that manage to excavate out and form an elliptical feature. And Kaczorowski in the 70s went and blew across a sandbox and created vaguely bay-like features, and that continues to hold on as the most recently published terrestrial causation explanation. But here's where I differ from that, and I don't mean to go on too long, probably already have, but when we looked very carefully at a particular bay in Bladen County, North Carolina, more than 10 years ago now, in great detail, and mailed sample after sample after sample of bay sand out to the University of California, Santa Barbara, where Jim Kennett's Paleo Lab looked at the samples, under very detailed instrumentation, they found absolutely no sign that that feature was ever a lake.
Huh.
So you can't, if you believe they were caused by lakes, you have to explain those bays that were never lakes. And the YD team has published unrefuted directly evidence that some bays, particularly this one, and we've only done a limited sampling of these things, but I think what I can see at this bay, there are definitely other ones, many other ones that don't look like they were ever lakes. And this one we discovered definitively, to our mind, that it was never a lake. So how does it form into that neat ellipse? And this becomes controversial, and it becomes personally controversial, if I will, if you may, because I have a blog on the subject of the YD event, and my original interest was in Carolina Bays, and I continue to publish anything that that provides any more information on them, including extraterrestrial theories. And there's two publishing teams, one a fellow named Antonio Zamora, who published a great paper, I believe. It may be wrong, but I think it was a heck of an effort, particularly for non-credentialed scientists, and to get it published in Geomorphology in 2017, suggesting that the bays were actually the result of large chunks of the ice sheet crashing back down into the unconsolidated sandy sediments that have a very high water table, why they were in a liquefied state. And if you go and look up liquefaction and earthquakes, you can see that what seems to be solid ground, when shaken sufficiently and with a high enough water table, can turn into a very viscous slop. And that something that crashes into it, particularly made of ice, was Zamora's, quite fantastic, but interesting and published hypothesis that it would leave a raised rim around it and collapse back in itself. And of course, there would be no evidence of the iceberg, if you will, or the glacial ice chunk when it melted, but there might be a raised rim that would indicate from whence it came. And if you follow the radial axes of the Carolina Bays back to their point of origin, you find a place on the ice sheet that roughly matches where the forensic evidence of the YD team believes something may have happened. But there's a lot of little side stories here. Another great advocate of the ET theory, if you will, and we're not talking aliens. We're just saying that the causation came from outside the terrestrial Earth. Is a fellow named Michael Davies, and he runs a website called Cintos.org, CINTOS, that has an incredible amount of information on the Carolina Bays, and I highly recommend it. He does not believe that they were related to the YD event, and he actually believes that there's over 700,000 years old.
Wow.
So there are a lot of different factions to the way that this thing, plays out, Carolina Bays. I do not think that it assists the YD hypothesis. It probably hurts it. I call it sometimes the kooky caboose of the greater hypothesis. So you've got the train that rocks down the tracks, very powerful locomotive, a serious train of evidence that's running down the tracks of science and being published again and again and achieving more and more, and the evidence is getting more and more detailed and more finely tuned. And then you got this Carolina Bay thing hanging off the back of it that probably does us no good. Okay, that it's just too wild to believe that there are mainstream scientists, even our friends of the YD Impact on the team, that vociferously disagree with it. So does it help? Hell no. Does it hurt? It probably does. So we try not to. We try not to focus on it, and I continue to, will always be associated with it. And you search Carolina Bay, you're going to find George Howard out there. But I think there's still some unexplained things. So I'll stop there. I'll go to a few questions, or you can switch over to Randall, or however you want to handle it. That's a long explanation for you, my friend.
It's all the Randall I can handle. And this would kind of be like the metaphorical junk in the trunk of the Younger Dryas impact experience for.
There you go. The crazy ant in the attic.
Now,
okay, that everybody knows is up there, but nobody wants to talk about over dinner.
Well, I was thinking more from a more music video style. I'm just wondering if like the theory can twerk at this point. For the younger people who listen to the show, they'll probably get what that's all about. And I can't twerk personally. You don't want to even see that. Randall, I'm going to ask the next question for you, and I'm just going to switch over the this one.
I'm not seeing you guys right now. I'm only seeing myself with a. Are you screen sharing me?
No.
I think maybe you need to turn something off because I can't see George.
Oh, it's because I turned off screen share. 1 second here. I'll get that going. Just a moment. Screen share.
Okay.
Am I screen sharing? Screen.
I'm seeing you now, Chris.
There we go. And there is George. And there you are.
And now I'm seeing George. Yep.
Okay. And now George is gone. Where's my Skype? Skype, where are you? Okay. Whenever I screen share, it switches off, and that's kind of a Windows thing, I'm going to guess. Let me just...
There we go.
Turn off studio mode.
So I think I would just corroborate what George was saying about the bays and say that the bays themselves are still a mystery, and there's all kinds of different ideas about them. As George said, they're controversial. They may or may not have anything, in the end, they may or may not have anything to do with the Younger Dryas, but the Younger Dryas doesn't need the Carolina Bays.
Mm-hmm.
That's well put.
It can stand on its own, regardless of what the answer comes down to be with the Carolina Bays. However, before we get off the Carolina Bays, it might be instructive to show something here that, you know, if you many lessons that we've learned from the Tunguska event of 1908, and I just, you know, that was an aerial burst, and it may have actually been a fragmentation event. But I want to look at a couple of things on the. I had the images right here. Jesus, as far as the Carolina Bays. I was going to show here on the Tunguska event. Let me just get it. Here we go. Okay. I'm going to do a screen share here. And when I do that, under the Tunguska event, where the conical shock front intersected the land surface,
I think we still have you.
Okay, if I can, let's see. Select screen. Okay, allow here now. Okay, I should now be screen sharing. Okay, can you see this?
Yes, I can.
Okay, take a look. Have you ever seen this picture, George?
Absolutely, I have. And when I first saw it in 1996, or around then, I called Roy Gallant. Yeah.
You did?
I did.
And what did he have to say about it?
He was fascinated by the Carolina Bays, as anybody that had put them together would be. And there you go. That is a great picture.
Yeah, no, that is below the epicenter of the Tunguska atmospheric explosion.
Oh,
that's right.
And to me, I look at that and I go, really?
Yeah.
Let's go to this.
Beneath the epicenter. Whoa.
It brings back memories, Randall. Those were some of the pictures when I was
exploded.
looking at Carolina Bays, and it's so interesting that, you know, in I think it was 1927, Leonard Kulik was the first person to go out to Tunguska, and he dug fruitlessly. I think it was the second expedition where they finally started digging and tried to dig in those oval bogs and was looking for a meteorite, looking for a chunk of iron material down there that would indicate that it was a crater. Well, at the same time, on the other side of the world, they were digging through the Carolina Bays looking for a meteorite as well. But you know something exploded over there. And here, we do not know that, but the result was the same. No one ever found anything down below them. So they're certainly not primary impacts. They're either effect of the secondary shock wave, or are secondary impacts of other material, which is, thrown up from an impact elsewhere and then lands in the Carolinas.
Yeah. I am not ready to discard an extraterrestrial hypothesis for the formation of the Carolina Bays. I don't know what the answer is, but I still think we need to keep our options open because, like you said, there's so many variable ideas about it that, and they're not all right and they're not all wrong. So we've still got some work to do.
Well, what I find, Randall, and I think you saw it, we had a little meeting on the Carolina Bays last fall with some folks, kind of a private proprietary meeting. And what you'll have is people absolutely opposed to any consideration that they were calls simultaneously and calls from above. But then those two opponents of that idea will completely disagree about what did cause them.
I know, that's my point.
Right. It's only when they come to agreement and can agree on one terrestrial causation mechanism and it can explain all of the observed features, of which there are a number of observed features that are very, very puzzling. Can we say that all the questions have been asked, or excuse me, have been answered?
I want to see an incipient bay. I want somebody to point out and say, okay, here we see a Carolina Bay in the early stages of formation. Here we see one in the late stages of formation. We don't really see, it's kind of like the fossil record. Where do we see the progenitors of what is going to become a bay eventually? See, I don't know if
Randall, and along those same lines,
actually pointed out and been able to say, there we go. You know, another 10,000 years, this will be a bay.
That's right. Along those same lines, the recent terrestrial causation, you know, ordinary prosaic causation literature, they'll tell you, Dr. Moore and others, that there were several bay-forming episodes. Some of them separated by tens of thousands of years. So there might have been 4 or 5 different episodes where bays were formed, and then things went quiet again. Presumably the winds calmed down, and then bays were formed again. It would seem to me that you would be able to find generations of each of those.
That's what I mean.
Look across the landscape and say, well, here's a set where the wind was, you know, this direction. And then 10,000 years ago, the wind was somewhat similar, but it was slightly different. And you can see this set, that there would be different, that there would be different families of them. That the earlier ones wouldn't all reorient themselves to look indistinguishable to the later generations of formation. And we may be running, you know, too far down the rabbit hole for the viewers. I hope not. But Chris, are we understandable?
I understand where you're coming from, and if anybody listens to these shows, it's like they're just like, my God, they're talking such cool stuff right now. So you guys go. You're on a roll.
Well, if just for the viewers that haven't really seen what we're talking about, we can go. I've got the mosaic that was the first mosaic from 1930? About 1933,
yeah, 33.
was it? 1930.
Looking through them, I've seen it several times.
Can you see this?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, so this is a mosaic. This is the first aerial survey, and this is where it began to dawn on, you know, people that there was something really extraordinary out there on the southeastern coastal plain of the United States. And before this, no one really had understood that there was these thousands of these oval features that had a similar orientation, a long axis oriented roughly northwest southeast, until this first aerial survey. And you can see these are all separate photographs that have been laid out in the form of a mosaic. Here's a pretty interesting one from the same survey where you can really see the parallel alignments of the long axes. And interestingly, if it was an extraterrestrial object, what this does seem to suggest is it was coming in from the northwest. I'm interested now. How did Chris date the Carolina Bays? And by the way, was that out and walked the rim with Chris Moore?
Yeah.
Okay, that was Herndon Bay. Okay.
Yeah, you in South Carolina, sure.
He doesn't use he uses optically stimulated luminescence.
OSL,
am I right?
optically stimulated luminescence dating, which is somewhat squirrely, but they certainly seem to find some consistency in their dates, it seems.
Yep. So could the kind of event we're talking about bias or affect the OSL dating? Is that possible?
I've heard speculation from some others in our team that believe that, that more along the lines that what could happen, and let me see if I can get this right, is that one thing, if you picked up and moved the sand at night and it replaced itself and it was buried again, you wouldn't see a change in the date.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it would continue to show an old date. OSL shows you the time that the sand grain was last exposed to the sun.
Right.
So let's say there's some dates that are much older, and I'm not making claims, but there are dates that are much older than the 12,800 years, and they date back to 40 or 50,000 years with OSL. Well, what happened if the event happened at night and the sand grain was launched into the air and replaced itself later? It would continue to be from OSL, a 50,000-year-old sand grain, but it had been picked up and moved, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that can cause problems for that. If I can, I've got a good little, we're kind of getting dragged down in the bays. I was concerned this would happen, but...
Well, we're at least going to be moving on to a pretty interesting subject that at least I know that if we didn't talk some esotericism on this show, especially with Randall here,
yeah,
I would get angry emails for weeks. And I told Randall that it's like at some point I'm going to have you on here to be able to talk, Masonic symbolism with regards to the Younger Dryas impact, because I know that he's talked about it extensively, and I know that he has tons of theories that seem to actually line up with some of the stuff that I've heard some of the other brothers up here, in Lodge who are into some of the interesting subject matter.
Well, I want to hear from that. If that's where you want to segue to, I'm looking forward to that. I'd like to give one screen share of a little video of the bays if I could.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, okay, so share screen. Are y'all seeing mine now?
Yes.
Okay, are you seeing a YouTube video?
Yes, we are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I had a little fun. When did I do this? It'd be 9 years ago. Now, so you can see that just fine, right? As we go into North Carolina, I'll go ahead and not waste too much time. That's a large feature that even some bay nuts may or may not be a Carolina bay per se, but it certainly resembles all the rest. And you can see how they're laid out there across the landscape by the dozens and dozens in every close-up and the hundreds and hundreds in every long field shot. And each of those bays is, the large ones you see there, 2 or 3 miles long. And then you're moving over, and those are in pristine condition. Notice only a very few of them are lakes, but the mainstream theory is that every single one of them was formed by a lake at some point. And I'll show you here. I'll take you to the fun part where we light up what they look like. Okay. And that's I-95, the major corridor down the East Coast. There's the Atlantic Ocean. There's about 40% of 40% of North Carolina. And they're absolutely everywhere. And, they reach all the way down into Georgia, all the way up into New Jersey, almost into New York. But they're along the North Carolina, South Carolina line. They're found in the greatest abundance. But see, the people that live there do not even know that they live near one of those features. Mm-hmm. Some of them will. And the lakes are obviously bays, but they don't know that these other bays that they find out that you can see from above in the farm fields, etc., are even there because they're only visible in aerial photography.
Yeah, I'm actually seeing right here what's coming up next. YouTube videos. There's Antonio Zamора's.
That's right.
Tony's. That for the
so I just want to show that it's hard to really communicate their extraordinary presence on the landscape in such a large part of America. There we are pulling back in. And this is just North Carolina. You would find them in Georgia, South Carolina, and above. But we actually identified every single one of them. A great guy named David Kimball went and circled every single one of them. And then Michael Davies at Centos.org has continued that. There they are again at I-95. Yeah. Anybody that's ever driven to Disney World has driven right through thousands and thousands of them that actually cross the highway. Okay, so I hope that that wasn't too much of a divergence, but just wanted to add a little eye candy there.
Holy crap.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you for your patience there. So I will turn off my screen share now. Stop sharing. Okay. Back to you, host.
I don't know if I can follow that. That's just
Really, Zuger? You already knew what they were and stuff. Was that a good eye opener?
That's it's like somebody took a shotgun full of buckshot and just or like even bird shot, just aimed at the ground and just blasted a couple of shots off. That's insane.
That's what it intuitively suggests, but what they'll tell you, mainstream geomorphologists and geologists will say that we're fooling ourselves, and that something formed them from above, and that was wind. It coordinated with water below.
Invite them for like a beer into like a very large room with a screen, lock the doors, and then show them that, and then don't let them leave until
we tried that last fall.
But... Did you try bribing with scotch? That may work. I don't know. Did geologists drink scotch?
We'll get to that. We'll get to that one day.
Okay.
Well, listen, I didn't mean to take it over the base. Randall, what you got for us?
Okay, well, I'll preface this.
I'm going to let Chris kind of guide me into. I mean, I've got too much to cover in the next however long we've got. So
as long as you want.
I'm going to let Chris kind of.
Is literally as long as you want. So it's this is coming from Abraham Edwards, who asked this question. I think it was the last segment that I always try and preface these in whenever there's a segue. And he's asking if you were inspecting any sacred geometry, and he uses the quotation mark, sacred geometry, in the cataclysmic patterns and evidence, or have you dismissed that platform? And I'm going to segue that with the second part into, well, you have done a fair amount of research into the symbolism of, let's say, the Grail mythos, and how that was how that had encoded the knowledge of the initial impact, which again you can check out on Sacred Geometry International's website, which will be in the show notes after the show. And we've only briefly touched on some of the Masonic symbolism, and I'm mentioning this due to the fact that the Masonic Traveler has joined us in chat. He's the other very world famous Masonic guy on the planet who deals with this type of symbolism as you do, Randall. So, how is this tied into the esoteric symbolism? How is it we have had this knowledge that's been carried through for the last 12,000 years? And how is it that our fraternity has been, well, at least in your estimation, has been saddled with this very important information that we've tried to share with the world at various points in time?
Wow. Okay. Well, I think that there are multiple traditions that suggest that, this has been part of the human legacy on Earth. I guess I can just pull up a couple of things here. Images. Can you see this?
I can, yes.
Yeah, this is very typical. This is from the Greek, Zeus hurling a thunderbolt. Well, what was the thunderbolt? That's the question that he was hurling. And, as we go through ancient stuff, we find that there is a series of images that were constantly associated with extraterrestrial type phenomena. And we can see here, like from this history of Japan, it's describing a particular event that happened during the reign of this particular king. And as it's saying here, there was suddenly a violent storm of thunder and light, comets, fiery dragons, and uncommon meteors appeared in the airs, and it rained fire from heaven. Dragons is one of the typical images that's associated with these events. Another one is the sword. Here we see from a 1926 work by Mary Proctor talking about traditions associated with comets. And we see here, this is from a comet apparition in AD 69. Amongst other warnings, a comet, one of the kind called Ziphius, because their tails appear to represent the blade of a sword, was seen above the city for the space of a whole year. So the sword, here's another image often associated with a burning torch. So you see, you have this collection of these images. Here's another one from China. They were thought of as brooms and called broom stars because there the tradition was that the comet came through and swept away like a broom all that pre-existed and created a new world in its wake. Here we see the a textbook of commentary forms from ancient China showing the various comet types. Here we see 7 of them, and we see, notice on the left, here's very possibly, Carl Sagan endorsed this idea that this was possibly the origin of the swastika symbol, that people were actually witnessing a spinning comet nucleus that was jetting off volatile gases while it was spinning. And we see here several different, here's kind of the blade of a sword. There's many different ways that these events were associated. Here we find an Iron Age spear that was actually made out of meteoritic iron. And notice again the symbols on there. Here's your swastika that could represent a spinning cometary nucleus generating volatile gases. Let's see here. So anyways, what I'm getting at here is that there's a number of these images. Dragons was an extremely potent one. If we look at this one, here is from Mayan traditions, from Mayan codices, and basically here is the celestial serpent or dragon belching out the waters of the great flood. So we see right there that connection with the idea between the flood and something celestial or something cosmic. We can see here another Mexican codex, and we see that here is depicted
Randall, I think we lost you.
1967. There's a long established that comets and fireballs and things were associated with certain.
It's a bandwidth related. I'm going to see if I can lower my resolution to him, just so he's not. Oh, I can't even bandwidth. Outgoing video. There we go. That should help him at least a little bit. Video. Randall, we it seems we're still connected. It may just be your bandwidth that's causing a little bit of a slowdown in your audio. Oh no, he's left the chat apparently. So we may have actually. Oh my goodness! See, it seems the deep state does not want to have this information out, which I always use as an example. Let me.
They've shut down our communications.
Possibly, it looks like. So I've got you on there.
I accidentally dropped out a moment ago, but got back on. He's probably trying to do the same.
All right, well, let me. I'm just gonna
Am I back?
Yes. Oh, yes, you are, sir.
Ah.
There.
I got disconnected for a while, and I'm not sure where I got disconnected.
You were going through.
Well, you were doing a great job.
Whatever I was doing. Okay.
It's fantastic. You were talking about the Mayan tradition with the serpent or the celestial serpent belching out the floodwaters.
So we were on this slide right here, right?
Yes, I'm seeing you on camera, but I'm not seeing your share screen.
Okay. Let me go back to share screen then. Let's go back to share screen. Allow. Okay, I think we're there. Let's go back to where I was. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Sure
Okay,
can.
so there it is. That's from the Dresden Codex. And what we see here is the celestial serpent or dragon right up here at the top, belching out the waters of the great flood. And this was the flood within Mayan mythology that was one of the 4 great cataclysms that destroyed the world. And we see down here the god of death holding this sword, right? And in his right hand, he's holding what appears to be a thunderbolt. And then here we see a very interesting painting by what's his name? Not Gustave Dior. It'll come to me in a second. But this was a painting that represented the myth, the fall of Phaeton. And I don't know if you're familiar with the myth of the fall of Phaeton, but that's clearly an meteoritic allegory. And in that myth, you know, Phaeton was the son of Helios, the sun god, and he attempted to drive his father's chariot in the path of the ecliptic, but the great steeds that were pulling the chariot were so powerful that they were able to pull the chariot off the plane of the ecliptic, and it descended down to earth, and it set the earth on fire, and generally has been considered to be a metaphor for some kind of a cosmic encounter. And this was an interesting painting from the early 1800s, and it's the myth of Phaeton, and you see the chariot falling to earth here, and you see right here in the background the blazing comet, and you see up here is the plane of the ecliptic, and this artist is placing this event right square on the cusp of Leo, which interestingly occurred 12,900 years ago. So I don't know if that's just coincidence or how that ended up there. Then I went on to show this more from the Codex, the Mexican codices. We see a meteorite depicted as a serpent descending from the sky. And then we see this is from Theatricum Cometicum, 1667, traditional European depiction of a comet as a cosmic serpent. And yet here's still another depiction, meteorite as a descending dragon. So this was one of the most common of symbols employed to represent these kinds of cosmic phenomena, whether it was meteorites, fireballs, comets in the sky. Then we go on to this. This is the largest extant serpent effigy in North America. Serpent Mound, Ohio. Have you been there, George?
No, I haven't, but I was just on another podcast with the 7 Ages research team, and they made a great field trip up there a couple of months ago.
Now,
Absolutely fascinating.
I've had multiple conversations with Ross Hamilton about that. I think of my first interview about that, I had actually referenced your research with regards to this being a possibility for a representation of cometary impact. Interesting thing about this particular formation that he had mentioned is the number of lightning strikes that it tends to attract because of the high iron content, which apparently is located in the head.
Interesting.
Yeah. It also lies in the center of an old meteorite crater, a huge one.
Yeah.
Now,
it's actually it's on the rim. And this the next photograph here, you can actually see on the raised rim, and you can see the serpent. And what's interesting about this, you can actually kind of see that the serpent effigy itself mimics the landscape, and you can actually follow the contours of the landscape that formed the rim of this ancient astrobleme. And the rim itself is serpentine, and you can actually, if you look at this particular image, you can see the triangular viper-shaped head, and then you can see the coil of the serpent winding around this way. And this is the rim of the impact crater. The impact crater.
That's a great image, Randall.
It's an area renowned for a large geological disturbance, the remnants of perhaps the most cataclysmic event ever to occur in Ohio. Serpent Mound sits on the outer edge of the disturbed area, which measures 3.5 to 4 miles in diameter. Within the central part of the area, rocks have been thrust upward at least 1,000 feet above their original positions. And that's normal in impact cratering when you have a central uplift. That's a rebound phenomenon. And surrounding this area is a lower area where rocks are approximately at their normal elevations. A ring graben, which is just simply a downfall ring, forms the outer portion of the structure, and here the bedrock has been dropped 400 feet. So you have an uplift of 1,000 feet, you have a drop down of 400 feet, so that's a differential of 1,400 feet. And then within that, the bedrock is all fractured and cracked, and fault lines emanate out from the structure, which probably creates some interesting gravitational, geomagnetic, and hydrological phenomena. So this is, again, consistent with this. And why that they chose to put this serpent effigy on the rim of an ancient astrobleme? I don't know. Did they know about that some way? I don't know. Or is it just coincidence? But yeah, we can go on here. Here we see the flag of Wales, and studies of the flag of Wales show that it basically represents a cometary event. And we don't have time to get into all of this now, but he goes into the actual origin of the Welsh term, like for the red dragon, and so one of the meanings of that is meteorite or lightning stone, which is and trail of the dragon. So here we see these same symbols and imagery showing up over and over again. So what we can then say is that there were numerous ways of representing comets. Here's another depiction of different comet types, and showing some of them, how people likened them to swords in the sky and implements of war. Let's see. Yeah, and then here's another one which shows the way it was imaged was as a sickle. You see, here's the comet seen in Arabia from 1479, from Prodigiorum ac Ostentorum Chronicon. And anyways, if I pronounce that right, or if I completely butchered it, but you see here it's represented as a sickle or a scythe. So, which is interesting because I'll just get into this one Masonic thing right here, since you asked about that. And you see this picture here is something you see in many Masonic books, Masonic lodges. You may have seen this, Chris.
Oh, yes.
And you see Father Time, who is usually depicted as Saturn. He holds a scythe, and he's plaiting the long hair of the Weeping Virgin. The Weeping Virgin holds in her right hand the sprig of acacia, which represents regeneration, restoration. The idea, like in the Masonic allegory of the murder of the master builder, the way he was recovered was, or rediscovered, his buried hidden body of acacia, which represents the regeneration of life after death. And I think in the context that we're talking about here, it could represent, for example, the restoration or replenishment or regeneration of the biosphere in the wake of a catastrophe. And the hair is important here because this alludes, to the long hair, and the word comet, literally means long-haired. So once you begin to understand the symbols of these events and how these symbols can be arranged in certain ways, they can convey meaning. She's weeping over a broken column, and that broken column represents the world that has been lost in the catastrophe.
Yes,
here's an interesting another depiction from the early 1800s, and you see here this elliptical oval here, and this comet is represented as a long-haired woman, and her hair is blazing out. And notice in each hand she holds downward pointing torches. And remember, that was one of the typical images that were associated with comets, that they were torches burning torches descending to Earth. And so here you see the depiction of the long-haired woman, the comet. She's holding in her arms the downward pointing torches. And then you see below here a wasteland. You see a devastated landscape. The trees are barren. There's tremendous winds blowing. Here's a woman entreating heaven. You know, people are panicking. They're falling down. They're prostrating themselves before the events. You see smoke from fires in the background here. So clearly this art is associating the appearance of this great comet in the sky with the devastation of the land below. But then there's another aspect of it, which is really interesting, is when you get down here to the very bottom, you see that this was the great comet of 1811 that inspired this particular work of art. And what you see here is in the aftermath of that, was this tremendous prolific growth and fecundity in nature that particular year. Which is very interesting, and because we see one of the things that's come out about the Tunguska event since the end of the Cold War and the opening up of Soviet Russian research is that there was accelerated evolution and accelerated growth apparently within the zone that was affected by the explosion of the Tunguska object. And some of these materials that are associated with these comets and other celestial objects, being particularly the platinum group metals, these are catalysts. And I think we're just like on the beginning to understand that there may be a pretty powerful response within the world of vegetation and in the biosphere to these incursions of celestial objects. And this would be consistent with traditions that go back centuries and millennia, and it's represented right here in this particular work by this particular artist. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting possibilities here. Here's a list I've compiled by going through a lot of this ancient literature. Here's a list that I have compiled of various symbols that have one time or another been associated with these type of cosmic events. Dragon, serpent being the most prevalent, but swords, spears, and arrows, long-haired, also bearded, beams, burning torches or lamps, thunderbolts, swastikas, brooms, a chariot, scythe or sickle, the omega symbol. So all of these, I think, are ways that archaic peoples had to preserve and represent their experiences with cosmic events. And so I think this is kind of buttressing the idea that I think has scientific validity now, or credibility, is that perhaps there have been more encounters between Earth and things from the sky than anybody had previously imagined, that it may be a fairly regular phenomena within the natural order, that these things might be more common than people have previously or scientists had previously imagined them to be. And there's a lot of different interesting work along that, and showing that there may have been even as many as 4 or 5 significant impacts just during the Holocene or the last 10 or 11,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
I think one of the most prevalent ones, and one that you discussed recently, and it's available on the Sacred Geometry International YouTube channel, and I believe also Geocosmic Rex, is the one that happened around, again, don't hate me guys if I'm wrong on this one, within about 4,000 years ago in the southern Indian Ocean off of South Africa.
Possibly. There's a lot of evidence, but what appears to be an impact crater is 2 miles on the bottom of the Indian Ocean, so nobody's been able to actually go there and get samples. This is based on the work by Dallas Abbott, who is, I believe, is she part of the Comet Research Team, George?
No, they call that's the Holocene Impact Research Group.
Right,
They're
okay.
kind of less active than we are and don't publish as much, but they're concerned with impacts since the Pleistocene Holocene transition, right, and what we believe the impact period was and today.
And their work certainly does support the idea that that impact events are more prevalent than imagined. Clearly, I would say that what we're looking at in the Younger Dryas, in terms of the mass extinction event, we have to go back 3 to 5 million years to find something equivalent. And I've always kind of used species loss as being an indication of habitat loss, which is then in turn an indication of the amount of devastation.
That's
So I
right.
think clearly for the younger Dryas event, we're looking at perhaps the largest, most extreme cosmic encounter of the last 3 or 4 or 5 million years even.
Now, this is a good segue, and I try and always make sure that I can get the questions in from the YouTube chat. Purplesaurus Rex, best name ever, asks if what your opinion is on, and again, I do apologize if I butcher this name, Nathan Myhrvold's work criticizing Neowise's consistency and how that we are at a higher risk of impact events than NASA lets on.
I didn't quite understand the question.
What your opinion is on Nathan Myhrvold's, and again, I do apologize if I butchered that name, Nathan Myhrvold's work criticizing Neowise and their consistency, and whether we're actually at a higher risk of impact than NASA lets on.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that controversy. I know who Nathan Myhrvold is. He's one of the early scientists at Microsoft and worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I did not know, but I am pleased to hear that he is a skeptic about the mainstream thinking about impact frequency, which is what all this gets down to. And I know that Neowise, of course, is that's an infrared solar object and near Earth object detection system that NASA's deployed. And I believe they put it back up there and then turned it back on. The Cosmic Tusk, my own blog, and really my own research always concerns the past, which is the same with Randall. We don't spend a whole lot of time, saying repent, repent. The end is near.
Thankful for that.
Yeah, that's right. And but I think there's room for that, and there's room to say that obviously if there were more frequent impacts in the past, then we're underestimating what could happen in the future.
Yes. My thought would be about NASA, though, that
now, but it seems like Myhrvold
I don't see what their real motive would be in downplaying, because after all, I mean, the impact threat could certainly be a justification for increased funding for NASA, from my point of view. If we need to have better monitoring of near-Earth environment, which means satellites dedicated for that purpose. Really, as it has been proposed, I mean, an ideal place for observing what's going on that scale in the solar system would be a lunar-based observatory. But so I don't know, for me to believe that NASA was somehow deliberately downplaying it, I don't know what their motive for that would be. Whereas I could certainly see a motive for the opposite of that, is that, yeah, I mean, if we're under serious threat from the cosmos, then, that certainly could be a mandate for NASA to get going here with, the survey of near-Earth environment and find out really once and for all as much as we can as what's out there. I mean, in the last few months, we've had a couple of close calls. We've had a couple of large objects that were 7 and 10 times the mass of the Tunguska object coming within the orbit of the moon within the last few months. So I think clearly when we look at what we see, when astronomers look into the cosmic environment, what they're seeing is that it appears to be a whole lot more densely populated than anybody was imagining 30 or 40 years ago. And also, as geologists are looking at the ground beneath our feet, they're discovering that really the Earth is pockmarked with hundreds and hundreds of impact craters or impact scars, which are actually called astroblems, if it's not a classical bowl-shaped crater. We look at the moon, and the moon, the entire surface of the moon is hundreds of thousands of impact scars. And you can calculate that based upon the larger cross-section of the Earth and the greater mass, Earth is somewhat like 80 times more susceptible to impacts than the moon. So there's no reason to assume that impacts are not a regular part of the natural order of things, and that not only, I mean, I think where we're at with this now is we're recognizing that impacts have played a very major role in things not only mass extinctions and climate change, but geomagnetic field fluctuations, volcanism, some of the great, because now there's a strong correlation between some of the great basalt floods and impacts. The Deccan traps, the Siberian traps, possibly the Columbia basalts. So, I mean, in many ways, impacts are beginning to appear to be a fundamental process, not only in our astronomical environment, but in terrestrial geology and possibly even in evolutionary biology as well.
Now, Randall,
So,
I think we've lost your camera. Just I'm seeing George on two screens, so I want to make sure that if
I'm sorry about that.
oh well, no, well, as I said, our female viewership is very large, so that's fine. But with I know with Randall, if
Am I back?
Yeah, you are back, sir. Well, you've always been here, but again, as you were saying, sir.
Yeah, so that's my take. Is that I think we're kind of in this situation where we're realizing that in the long history of the Earth, impact phenomena has played a very critical role. I think what we're now getting into is recognizing the possibility that in cultural history, impact events, although of a smaller scale, might be playing a very important role. And it very well could be that, getting back to the idea and some of the ideas that Graham Hancock has been promoting, that there was a, perhaps, whatever we mean by this, a sophisticated civilization in the Ice Age. And he has amassed a tremendous amount of evidence that doesn't prove, but points in that direction. And again, qualifying what we mean by sophisticated. And I think that it clearly implies a knowledge of navigational skills, a knowledge of astronomy, a knowledge of at least some geology and mathematics, geometry in particular, and possibly on a level, as Plato describes in Timaeus and Critias, in reference to Atlantis, whether we think of it as a literal or an allegorical representation of what might have occurred in the past. Basically, what he's describing is a quite well advanced maritime culture, perhaps like the Minoans or the Phoenicians. And I don't think we need to go beyond that. We certainly don't need to go to the alien thing. That's a whole other discussion. But like Graham says, in the stuff that we're talking about, particularly in the evidence he's amassed for things outside the conventional models of prehistory, we don't need aliens. I think George and I are the kind of aliens that we are interested in are, the things that are flying in from outer space, like asteroids and meteorites and comets. And I think that perhaps a lot of the things that traditions from ancient times that are being interpreted as aliens or extraterrestrials might really be talking about extraterrestrials of a different character, the kinds of things that George and I and the Comet research team and others are looking at. Because certainly George used the term earlier, extraterrestrial, and he qualified it to make sure that the listeners realized when he used the term extraterrestrial, he wasn't talking about aliens in flying saucers.
That's right.
Now, an interesting topic that at least I'm going to say there was one more that I was going to be able to at least do after this one, but this will be the second last topic I'll bring in, and that's the Planet 9. Now, for all of you out there, no, Nibiru is not inbound, so calm your jets, don't sell your shit. That's, again, the only word I'll use on the show. But there is a fair amount of evidence that has been amassed with the trans-Neptunian objects that are seeming to point towards a trans-Neptunian planet that is way out there, possibly 200 some AUs, that takes like 20 to 30,000 years for people to complete one orbit. And obviously there has been postulations and rejections to the theory of a certain cyclical matter for impacts happening because of disturbed Kuiper Belt objects. Have either of you gentlemen looked into this theory, at least with the new evidence that's been presented? Or have you looked into new evidence?
George, you want to grab that?
Well, no, I think it's important that, it's still a question: what causes the large comets to come in? And I don't think we've really addressed that. Bill Napier and Klube's hypothesis or completely detailed it out. That what we believe happened that caused the YD event and subsequent events, and those would be still recognized as the torrid meteor showers, right, Randall? And those happen twice a year in both late June and late October, and are remembered as Halloween in late October. And late June, you have a good hint there that that's when the Tunguska event happened. That there are particularly that meteor shower, when Klube and Napier did the astronomy on it, they could draw that material back to a time where it would have been consolidated into one large comet that entered the solar system some 20,000 years ago. The question is, what tosses those comets into the solar system? And there's certain evidence that certain large bodies that have yet to be discovered perturb the Oort cloud, the furthest out body of orbiting cometary material, and throws material that is in a very, very, very distant extrasolar orbit into a solar orbit and brings it into the, where it can encounter Earth. Okay, so what brings that material in? But again, it's very important to point out that it's misunderstood in the YD theory frequently that either the large comet slammed in I saw it misreported this spring when we had the published study, or excuse me, in February when we published the big study, that we describe in the paper that approximately a 60 kilometer comet disintegrated and slammed in the Earth. The point is that comet had been disintegrating for some time before it encountered Earth. Okay, and that we encountered fragments of that comet, and we continue to encounter fragments of that comet, and they can be in lesser or greater measure. And it's a little bit like crossing the street, as Bill Napier once told me. When you cross a busy highway, sometimes you cross when it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and not terribly busy, and you can make it across just fine. But boy, when you go across at 4:30, there's going to be a lot more traffic. And what we're looking at now with the torrid stream is we're in a period where there's less traffic, and we're very fortunate in that regard, but occasionally we encounter more traffic. But all of that traffic is born of one large object that was kicked in from the outer reaches of the solar system some 20 or 30,000 years ago. And Chris, that gets to what does perturb that material into a closer solar orbit and a highly elliptical orbit, and that could be large bodies as you're discussing now.
Well, at least it's a link that I don't think has necessarily been looked into too much, and they're still trying to be able to prove that thing exists out there. And obviously, I know that for some of our listeners and viewers out there are a lot of theories with regards to what this planet is, and I know that there are some very interesting individuals out there that, if it is actually proven that this planet exists, that they're going to take it, they're going to run with it, and they're going to have some crazy theories about that. And at the end of the day, we haven't actually set foot on the planet. We haven't a probe out there. We don't know yet. But there's always that question about what's out there. And I'm going to finish off at least this segment in this show, and I'm going to let you, Mr. George Howard, head to bed, because you're hanging in there. And I want to.
Am I looking tired?
Well, no, you look fantastic. You always look fantastic. But I don't want to be able to keep you gentlemen up too late. I want to make sure we can end this before the clock actually strikes midnight on the eastern seaboard. How have you guys been doing as far as the current work? What do you have on the go that is in the works? What's exciting? What should people watch out for?
Well, I'm planning a trip this fall up to the Lake Nipigon region to explore the possibility that might have been an impact site. I don't know if you know anybody. Yeah, George, you're certainly aware of Lake Nipigon. If we've got a couple more minutes, I could actually pull up a graphic here. Let's see. I will go to share screen.
And Randall, since y'all have dated that trip, I may join you.
Well, I hope you do. I think that would be a lot of fun. Okay, I think I got it here. Let's see. Are you seeing this?
I am.
Yeah.
Okay, there's Nipigon. It is a lake that occupies a circular basin with a raised rim. At the end of the last ice age, like at the beginning, say prior to the Younger Dryas, this would have been under several thousand feet of ice. What's interesting about this and first drew me to it was the fact that there's evidence of extreme catastrophic melting in this area right here. And if you look at the southern end of it, there's a trough that actually is about 700 feet in depth. Let's see, I've got the actually some elevations here. You can see 1,500 feet here to the west and 1,500 feet to the east, and we're down to 746. So between 700 and 800 feet in depth is this trough that you see right here. Well, the trough basically sliced through this ridge with these catastrophic floods that then flowed down into what was then Lake Superior forming. And it left a whole series of massive erosional features that are
Oh no,
and there are spillways that were carrying hundreds of millions of cubic feet per second. Yeah, you want to interject something?
No, there you go. No, I thought we'd lost your audio. Keep going. Love this picture right here. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, so here I'm showing this is a digital elevation map showing the pathways of the water flows, these catastrophic water flows out of Lake Nipigon Basin. And let's see, I think we've got towards the end here, an interesting paper of the work of James Teller, who has been studying the Lake Nipigon Basin. And what happened was he went up there in the aftermath of some forest fires back in 1980, when he was actually able to see the landscape because the vegetation had been removed. And as it says here, quoting James Teller, we saw acres of giant boulders and deeply eroded bedrock that led me to conclude that there had been a gigantic flush of water across that area from glacial Lake Agassiz into the Great Lakes. Then in 1989, at the urging of oceanographers from Columbia University and the University of California, he co-authored a paper for the journal Nature describing for the first time how 10,000 cubic kilometers of water burst from Lake Agassiz into Lake Superior near Thunder Bay and spilled into the Atlantic Ocean. And here's where it gets interesting. The next paragraph, as you can hopefully see right here, importantly, this flood coincided with the advent of the Younger Dryas, a 1,000-year global cold snap, which began about 12,900 years ago. So, and then they actually go so far as to say, in his quest for answers, though, James Teller, found a new avenue to explore. About the time the Younger Dryas cooling period occurred, a comet seems to have collided with the Pleistocene ice sheet that dammed Lake Agassiz. So I don't know if Teller is anybody in the Comet Research Group interacting with Teller at all?
No, I'm astounded.
This is an older paper, but it certainly dovetails.
Nipigon, which I've always thought was fascinating, and particularly that channel. And if you look at that channel, see how it emerges out into Lake Superior, and there's what I call a whale tail of debris.
Yeah, the whale tail, yeah.
Yeah, and it just obviously, to me, spat that out into the lake, and I still haven't found any, good geological papers describing whether that land surface there, whether that actual accumulated material, is consolidated or solid bedrock.
Right.
It looks like it's unconsolidated material which was blasted out of that channel. But no, that's astounding. Yeah. I've already taken a note on that and had never seen that article, Randall.
Yeah, I mean, that really kind of ties it right in, doesn't it? And, like I said, I mean, it's textbook channel scabland geomorphology there. The difference being, of course, in eastern Washington, you're in a semi-arid environment, so you don't have the forest growth that allows you to see these features. If I go back to back to, I'll show you here. Here's an example of the comparison.
There you go.
If you can see this, this is the Black Sturgeon spillway coming out of Lake Nipigon on Google Earth. And then at the same eye altitude, here's the Missoula flood spillway called Moses Coulee. Now, Moses Coulee is estimated to have been carrying a discharge of possibly up to 350 million cubic feet per second. The capacity of the Black Sturgeon spillway is about a third of that, but that still puts it somewhere between 100 and 200 million cubic feet per second. And you can see that the modern Black Sturgeon River is just occupying this ancient, much bigger channel that was formed by this catastrophic outrush of water, as it was described in the Teller article we just looked at. But here's, very typical features. The one on the bottom now is totally acknowledged to have been formed by catastrophic floods. Interesting, Moses Coulee, I find to be very difficult to attribute to a draining of Lake Missoula for those who are actually following this kind of at that level. And Gene Hansen, who did his PhD dissertation on Moses Coulee back in the early 70s, actually speculated that the origin of the water that created Moses Coulee may not have been Lake Missoula in western Montana, but it may have come out of the north from British Columbia, which is the idea that I've been exploring for the last quarter century. And that's why I've made 4 trips to British Columbia now, and why I spent 4 days with Jerome Lessman last fall, who I mentioned was a student of John Shaw. And we were basically looking at the drumlin fields up on the Fraser Plateau, which I believe evidence is gigantic subglacial floods, which are hard to explain. And in fact, when John Shaw first proposed the idea that the vast drumlin fields were produced by subglacial floods, his idea was rejected because the volumes of water involved were so great that, just like when J. Harlan Bretz first proposed that the channel scablins had been created by these gigantic floods, his critics said, "Well, you can't provide a source for that degree of flooding, that scale of flooding. Therefore, the floods you talk about didn't exist." And essentially, it was the same idea directed towards John Shaw. Well, you can't explain where that much water comes from, because these drumlin fields that we're talking about are enormous. They're vast. They cover thousands of square miles, right? Well, the best that John did was come up with the idea that there was a reservoir of some kind, perhaps produced by increased solar radiation, perhaps produced by geothermal heat. He didn't really have an explanation, but his idea of a reservoir was rejected by the critics, saying that, well, the volume of water could never be retained by ice under those kinds of pressures. But see, here's the thing. Under this scenario, if we're talking about a younger Dryas impact into the ice sheet, we don't need a reservoir, because we've got instantaneous melting. We've also got a very convenient and effective means for accessing large volumes of water to the base of the ice sheet. So I don't know how many people actually watching this or listening to this know what a drumlin is, but a drumlin is
you might want to show a drumlin.
Pardon me?
It might be a good idea to show
a drumlin would be interesting, but I saw some other great pictures there. You've got such a wonderful presentation. I wish we had time to look at every one of them.
I know. I mean, I've only got somewhere between 10 and 12,000 images, so I probably have more than we could look at this evening.
Anytime you want to take a weekend off and say, "Hey, Chris, let's do this," yeah, I might be able to make that happen at some point. just go through every single one.
Well, I wonder if let's see, how much time we got left? Are we?
Well, yeah, this is kind of like the last segment, so we go whenever you tell me that you're done.
All right. Well, I will just up something here that you might find interesting to show the folks at home what we're talking about when I'm talking about drumlins. George, you know what a drumlin is.
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah. One of the great mysteries of geology, right up there.
They look like What was
easily
that?
dismissed, people attempt to easily dismiss them, but the answers are never satisfactory.
Right. But they're there. In some ways, I see sort of a parallel between drumlins and Carolina bays because they're so big, they're so vast. There's 100 different theories for the origin of drumlins,
and they're all oriented. They're all following the same rule if you can figure out what the rule is.
Okay, it's like at least correct me if I'm wrong on this. It's like a giant hill, in kind of a.
It's a sculpted hill.
Yeah, like a.
Yeah, and I'm going to pull up an
trying to think like
image in Google Earth so that people
and
can
if I
see.
may, while he works on it, and I hate to speak for Randall, he does such a good job himself, but the sculpted hill to traditional geology was sculpted by the ice itself, which is always
by the ice itself. Yes.
Yeah, these were underneath the ice. These somewhat delicate, unconsolidated things all formed under the heavy burden of the ice. And what Randall would say, and what John Shaw would say, and other far-sighted thinkers would tell you that no, they were actually formed during a catastrophe whereby the water beneath the ice sheet, or newly formed water beneath the ice sheet, rushed out suddenly under great pressure. Is that fair, Randall?
Yeah, that's fair.
Try drumlins near Auburn, New York.
Yeah, we'll look at that. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, there we go.
Okay. We're looking at, and this is southeastern Wisconsin, and I'm going to zoom in here so people can see these. These are drumlins. They're elongated hills. They tend to look like inverted boat hulls. And actually you can look here and you can kind of see they are oriented, but they're actually oriented towards an epicenter. Yeah, this is in Wisconsin, and you can see how there's several thousand of them here. Then I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to go over to western New York by the Finger Lakes. This is between north end of the Finger Lakes and the south end of south shore of Lake Ontario. And I'm going to zoom in, and you're going to see, once it comes into focus, a magnificent drumlin field. Can you see that? These are like, you see, these are streamlined forms. They're composed of glacial till that has been sculpted into these elongated, streamlined forms that, like George said, were, for the most part, most researchers from the, going back to the mid 1800s, believe that they were somehow sculpted directly by the ice sheet, until John Shaw came along and said, no, they were created by flowing water going under the glaciers. And really, it's how a glacier basically grinding across the landscape is going to create these elegant streamlined forms like this is still not explained well, whereas water would do it. And of course, to me, the clincher is that many of the drumlins have interior stratification, and that's water, not glaciers. If it's stratified, that's what water does. It doesn't. Glaciers aren't going to stray. It's going to be completely chaotic jumble. But as you can see here, I'm going all the way from Rochester. They start here. You can see they're actually south of Rochester. They kind of fade out over here, but they're very prominent south of Rochester. And then you come across here, and there are thousands of them. We can zoom in, and you'll really see how spectacular they are. And they definitely relate to the Finger Lakes, because the ice sheet ended right here at the northern boundary of the Finger Lakes. And I think that there's a continuum here in that you've got the drumlins, if they're formed by subglacial floods that are issuing out from the perimeter of the ice sheet right here. And then once it gets a free surface, it begins to downcut into this shale bedrock and produces these elongated lakes, which you'll notice have axes that all converge if you look at it on a deep basin in eastern Lake Ontario. So I would nominate that as a possible impact site. That would have excavated the deep basin that occupies eastern Lake Ontario. The water would have shot under the ice sheet under great pressure, forming the glacial till into the streamlined forms that you see here. And then once the water gushed out from the edge of the ice sheet, it flowed through the fractured bedrock, which was all in this area composed of fairly friable shales. And then we see at the south end, we see that these glens are all formed into these channels, very much like we were just looking at the Black Sturgeon, the Moses Coulee, and so on. And if you actually go down and look at some of the bedrock erosion here, you find clear evidence of catastrophic floods on a major scale. So, because you can find potholes. That's one of the things that's characteristic of giant turbulent floods is you have potholes.
Now, I know around, especially since I've got family within that area, at least the northern side of the potential impact crater around Prince Edward County, that one of the big things of the northeastern part of that segment of Ontario is there's a segment of the Lake Ontario where you can't necessarily navigate via compass because of a massive iron deposit that is at the bottom of that lake.
At the bottom of the lake. Now that's very interesting, and that could be considered consistent with, what we're talking about here.
Cool.
I was trying to pull up some of the drumlin fields up in British Columbia that I was exploring. We've been up there 3 times now exploring these drumlin fields. You can kind of see them here, and I theorize that this was the area that was actually ultimately the source of the Missoula floods. That was actually the source of the water that created the channel scablands. And I've followed these routes, the Rocky Mountain Ranch, up the Okanagan Valley, up these other valleys that all trend north-south. And basically all along here, you can see the evidence of gigantic floods. And these floods are moving south. And if you look at the southern end where these valleys open up, they open up directly onto the Columbia Basalt Plateau, which is where the channel scablands are that J. Holland Bretz was looking at back in the 1920s and 30s. If we go over here to, let's see if we can see the Rocky Mountain Trench, which would have fed into the basin that is now considered to be the basin of Lake Missoula. And let's see if we can see those here. There's drumlins all on the floor of the, here we go. You can see the drumlins here on the floor of the Rocky Mountain Trench. So if John Shaw is right, then these were produced by subglacial floods. You can tell by the geometry of the drumlins that they're blunt on the up current end and tapered on the south, the down current end, and they lead directly down into what is now the Flathead Lake, which would have been just to the north. Yeah, so once you get down here to the Withrow Moraine, it's called, south of there, you would have been in the hypothesized Lake Missoula. Now, there's no question that this whole area was completely drowned under 1,000 or more feet of water at some point. What I question is whether that was actually like a static lake in the sense, or really whether it was a giant backflood being fed by rapid melting of the Cordilleran ice sheet over British Columbia. And I think the evidence supports that idea for many, many reasons, which is way beyond the scope of what we're talking about here tonight. But yeah, my friend and colleague Brad Young and I have traversed this land back and forth, exploring these valleys and looking at the evidence. And there's lots of evidence that I think is inconsistent with basically the prevailing model of a proglacial flood, a proglacial lake bursting out of an ice dam that would have actually been up here by Lake Pend Oreille. And I will be writing about this. I mean, the book I'm writing is going to have a lot of this information in it, and detailing the evidence far more than we could talk about here. But the point is that when you go back and you start looking, you realize that all the way around the ice sheet you can find evidence of gigantic meltwater floods emanating from the ice sheet. There are coulees all across the prairie. When you get into Minnesota, the last place that I went with Graham Hancock a couple of years ago when he was researching Magicians of the Gods was this place right here called Taylor's Falls. And Taylor's Falls was a place I used to go hang out when I was a kid. And the water, ultimately, it would have come from Lake Nipigon, fed through Lake Superior. A part of that would have drained down through what is now the St. Croix River Valley. And right in here, you can't see it here, but on this basalt ledge right here, there are a series of gigantic potholes, some of them 20, 25 feet wide and up to 80 feet deep. And these were drilled into the bedrock by highly turbulent, vorticular, literally almost like underwater tornadoes. And when you see what happened, tide flow being compressed through this this aperture here, very much like a Venturi flume. So the water gets tremendously turbulent, and once it gets turbulent, you start getting these vortexes in the water, highly intense vortexes, and they can pick up debris, and then that can literally drill right into the bedrock. And like I was saying earlier, that's one of the consistent proxies that you would look for in the landscape that would show you that there had been gigantic floods occurring in that area. And these particular potholes are quite impressive. So anyways, that, in fact, I would blame my, going up there as a kid all the time, because I grew up in Minneapolis, not far from here, kind of set me on this path of interest in these geological phenomena. And actually, I'm going back up here on October 26th. I'm going to go do a retreat with a group of Masons from the Midwest that want to learn about all of this.
Nice.
So we're going to do a retreat on 26th, 27th, 28th of October. And I'm going to take the brothers up on a field trip to show them this particular feature and explain to them the geohydrology that was involved in its formation.
Cool.
But that would come after the Nipigon trip, which I'm hoping I can get my act together by late September. And that works for you, possibly, right, George?
Yeah, that's right. Just a curious note, if you zoom in a little bit, that area is called the Dalles, just as it is in the Columbia.
The Dalles. Yeah.
Is that what you call it?
The Dalles of the St. Croix. Exactly.
Yeah.
And you find that word all over, and it's always in association with catastrophic flood features.
Yeah. Huh. A couple of thousand miles away, the exact same term in the same kind of
exact
geology.
same term for the same type of feature. Yeah.
This kind of leads into to a question that I know that Mark Nebel, who's been pretty patient, I'm going to be closing off the questions on this one after this one. And he's asking if you've ever heard of the sedimentary layer of mud and boulders that's washed up near the top of the northern slope of Unita Ridge in east of Salt Lake City. Or Unita.
No, I haven't. Give me a little bit. Say, what did he say again?
He said let me go back to the chat here. If you're familiar with the sedimentary layer of mud and boulders that is washed up to nearly the top of the northern slope of the Unita Ridge to the east of Salt Lake City.
Unita Ridge. No, but I'm going to certainly look it up.
That's U as in umbrella, I as in India, N as in November, T as in Tango, A as in Alpha. And it's range, not ridge, range.
Okay. No,
yeah, that's the mountain range. Well, that was, that's related to Lake Bonneville.
Oh.
At the end of the last ice age, Lake Bonneville was a gigantic lake covering a large section of Utah, and it underwent a catastrophic outburst on its northern rim that fed something like 30 to 40 million cubic feet per second for a year into what is now the Snake River Canyon that crosses southern part of Idaho and goes through Hell's Canyon, and undoubtedly Hell's Canyon was deepened by this year-long draining of Lake Bonneville. There is a very interesting outcrop by just south of Lewiston, Idaho, where you can see heavy, coarse Bonneville flood boulder gravel overtopped by fine Missoula flood back flood silts, which suggests that the two floods actually met in that area. And given that the back flood silts of the Missoula flood were very low, it was a very low energy depositional environment, it would not have been erosive. But what you don't see is any evidence of a hiatus between the deposition of the two very distinct layers, and which would suggest that they were occurring almost simultaneously. And, you know, if you look at Utah, Great Salt Lake is just a remnant of Lake Bonneville. And right there at Salt Lake City, Lake Bonneville was almost 1,000 feet deep. So it was washing up against the mountain range there, and would have undoubtedly left deposits. And that might be what he's talking. Yeah, let's see, say that again. I've been through those mountains, actually looking for, trying to correlate the Bonneville flood with the Missoula flood. But yeah, so yeah, I think that he's onto some. Now, I don't know specifically the outcrop he's talking about, but maybe he could, you know, send something more specific about where exactly that particular outcrop is. Because next time I'm that way, I'd probably like to have a look.
Well, Mark, if you're on my Facebook, so if you want to send me that information, I'll pass it off to Randall as quickly as I can. That's fantastic. I'd say that this one's in the book, boys. We're at the we're at the 3 hour mark, and I know that everyone's probably eager to get to bed now. I know that for Randall, he's no stranger to doing multi-hour podcasts, but we're all on the East Coast, and you know,
I'm kind of like the Grateful Dead of podcasts. You know, get me going. I'll go till the sun comes up.
Oh, that's the beautiful part. It's like when Randall goes, you just let him go, and he'll always work magic. It's which is why it's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, you know, Chris, I just love this stuff so much. I mean, you know, just to get the opportunity to talk about it, you know, because I can't just on my normal day-to-day, you know, just strike up a conversation with somebody and go, say, have you considered really what it means that drumlins are internally stratified?
And I'd probably,
you know, and they go,
yeah.
What? Huh?
Well, internal.
Let me throw up a quick picture, an aerial photograph of a beautiful drumlin, just so somebody can see what they actually look like. Can you see this, what I'm putting up here?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, that's a forest-covered drumlin in Saskatchewan. And you can see how it's elongated, and the right side of the picture was the upstream side. It's a blunter than the downstream, which is more tapered.
Now, by stratified, you mean that it's a continuous deposit?
No, what I mean is that the internal structure of the drumlin is layered.
Yes. Okay.
It has distinct layering, and a glacial deposit will not do that. Glacial till, like when you look at glacial moraine, it's completely a chaotic. There's no structure to it. Water is what imparts structure to these deposits.
And let it sort. Let the heaviers get to the bottom and the fines to the top.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, here's this next. What I'm showing up here now is one of the drumlins in western New York. And again, you see how it's got a blunt upstream end and a tapered, longer downstream end. So this would be what we would call a paleocurrent indicator, assuming that it is in fact created by flowing water. It would suggest, you know, that you could look at a drumlin and know which way the water is flowing. But there are many paleocurrent indicators that you learn to recognize when you're basically out in the floodlands in the field. And just like what George was saying, you know, typically if you have a water flowing through a constricted area, it will be flowing faster than it would flow. Let's say it's flowing through a constricted area and then it opens into a basin, or it's flowing on a steep gradient and then the gradient shallows out. In either case, what happens is that the water slows down. and its ability to pick up and train and transport sediment is a function of how fast it's moving, right? So when the water slows down, what it'll do is it'll start depositing the sediment load it's carrying. And it will always deposit the largest sediment first, then subsequently. So what you'll get is like what's called a graded valley train, where you might see this elongated feature, not unlike this drumlin that you're looking at right here. But then if you look at its internal composition, you see that its up current end has big rocks in it, and then it's the rocks get successively smaller towards the downstream end, and then at the end where it tapers off, it might be sand. And so once you can get access to the internal architecture of these features, then you can reconstruct, okay, the flood came from this direction, passed this way, moving this direction. And that's a lot of what I do in the field, is I look at these things and I map these things to try to understand the nature of these water flows and where they're originating, see? And that's what led me up into those drumlin fields up in British Columbia that I've been exploring. And you can see this very interesting area here in the midst, surrounded by all of these mountains, but you've got this one interesting plateau country here. And then on the plateau country, again, you've got thousands and thousands of drumlins. You can see them all here. And they're emanating from an epicenter that's very close to Prince George. And the flow direction, the paleo current direction, is south. Yeah, and there's the Finger Lakes that we were just talking about. There's an aerial photograph of a drumlin field up in Saskatchewan. So these things are huge, and it was because of the scale of these things that John Shaw's critics were rejecting his theory that they were produced by water, because they were going, wait a minute, you can't, there's no way you'd have that much water. But nonetheless, I think that the evidence is pretty consistent with water flow. So that's all I have to say about the matter at this juncture.
So it's kind of like when you squeeze the juice out of a grape on a plate, and you have all that juice that just kind of flies all over the place. It's just on a much larger scale. Wow. Well, gentlemen, I think we learned some really cool shit tonight, and I'm gonna be I've been holding back the waterworks towards the end of the show, so I wanted to extend my profound thank you and appreciation for sticking with us, and for the genuine.
So what you're trying to say then, Chris, is you want to open the floodgates of the great deluge.
Well, to a certain, it's the 100th episode. We've come a long way, and there's no finer two gentlemen that I would have wanted to be able to share this historic moment with. And Randall, I've been trying to get you on the show, for an actual show for probably about 2 years now. So it's good that I can.
Yeah,
have you
well,
on.
I did my best to avoid you for 2 years, but finally I couldn't anymore. I gave up, and I said, okay.
Oh, there you go.
I'll do it.
And I appreciate.
I want to
much,
just
brother.
tell the three websites. George's website, Cosmic Tusk, is awesome. He's got it. It's relatively new. I mean, you upgraded it recently. And it's really well done, very easy to navigate. And then Geocosmic Rex, which is Brad Young's website, who's my traveling cohort. And then Sacred Geometry International, which is Cameron Wiltshire, and he's done a fantastic job. And there's a lot of good stuff up there, particularly those who are maybe less interested in the geological end and more interested in symbolism and ancient traditions and all that. You'll find more stuff like that on the Sacred Geometry website. But yeah, so those are the three websites I'm going to recommend anybody listening to go check out.
Go
we
right
have
ahead.
an informational site for the Comet Research Group, the Younger Dryas Boundary Team, and that's cometresearchgroup.com.
Fantastic.
And that's not a blog or anything that's going to give you regular updates and that kind of stuff, but it's a good repository of the information and explanation of the hypothesis and some of the critical papers therein.
Yeah, it's my feeling that this particular event is one of the really seminal events that in order to really understand our place in the world today, we've got to go back 12 to 13,000 years ago and look at those events that transpired, because literally the whole planet was reshaped during this transition from glacial to interglacial, from the younger Dryas into the Holocene. And I think the consequences of that event are so far-reaching that we're still feeling the echoes of that event today.
And, these are questions that I know that a lot of people are still asking, and obviously we've got two gentlemen here that are trying to be able to provide a look into those answers. And, gentlemen, thank you very much for all of your hard work. And also, Randall, I think I mentioned to you or mentioned to George, at some point I am going to try and get a behind the scenes with Cameron as well as with your traveling companion, Mr. Young there, to try and get a good behind-the-scenes understanding. I know that Cameron said that he's not doing any shows until Gnosis is actually up and running. Do you have an inkling of an idea of when that that will get going?
He's been working hard on getting a studio set up.
I can understand
and then for the last couple of months I've been kind of out of the loop. As I said, I took a tumble, I broke my wrist, was in a splint, so I got way behind because I do all computer-aided design, which I discovered is really hard to do with a broken wrist. And then I had this major oral surgery 6 weeks ago, and for about 3 weeks I could barely talk. So everything kind of got put on hold, but the studio I think is about ready to go. I met with him earlier last week to go over content of the earliest podcast. So I think it's going to actually happen very soon.
Fantastic.
That's exciting, Randall. That's great to hear, man.
Well, yeah. I'm going to be tuning in every single episode. Guaranteed.
And George, maybe you can be our first interviewer. Our first interviewee.
Oh, gosh, I hope, take out the technical glitches and my ums and ahs, and I'm sure it'll be a fine show.
Oh,
yeah, I mean, initially, we're not going to do it live. We're going to do pre-recorded so that, then we can go in and, drop in the graphics and edit it and make it much smoother. And then, of course, at some point, we're going to do a live thing so we can interact.
That's terrific, Randall.
Obviously, we're live right now, aren't we, George?
Oh, yeah.
Chris?
Oh, yeah, no, we're totally live, and it's...
that's what I thought. Okay.
So it's...
never going away.
That's why I was trying to be careful of what I said, with the new modus operandi of trying to, appeal to, because, it's hard to have been in the construction industry for many years and not have kind of a salty vocabulary.
Hey, Chris, I'll give you just a little bit more as we close. There's really some astounding information that should be coming out relatively soon. And I'm not directly involved, but I've got my ear close enough to the ground so that we can hear the rumble. And I think within the next, let's say, year or two, and I think that's a very generous conservative estimate, there's going to be some published mainstream information that's going to take this to the next level.
I can't wait. See, now I'm all eager for the next one. We'll do this again for 200. That comes out.
Right, and then there'll be hundreds of scientists that are tremendously interested in this and much more skilled than myself and even Mr. Carlson that will come on and claim they knew it all along. Right, Randall?
Well, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, George, I think what you and I are doing is, certainly when you talk about, the details of this thing are extraordinary, and you bring in specialists and you can go so far, but what happens, when somebody gets too over specialized, they don't see the big picture. So somebody needs to come along who's looking at the bigger picture, and you may not understand every single detail of every different specialized venue of knowledge that's involved in this thing, but somebody has to kind of try to look at the patterns that put the whole thing together. And I kind of see myself in that role as well as George.
Well, it's kind of like sports. Sometimes the person who understands most is the observer, not the player.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the colored man in the booth.
Well, that's the exact opposite argument that our Ottawa Senators always give to why the fans should just keep quiet. But again, our team's a dumpster fire, so I'm not even going to talk about that. I'm going to see if I can play the outro. Let's see if the outro music actually plays, because then I can actually... Let's see if it actually plays. Come on, outro music. I keep having issue. I'm still working on this aspect to get it to work, but we'll try it out here. Let me open up the properties, and we'll browse, and I'll get the outro music. Outro. There we go. And play. It's kind of a... Takes a second to kick in, I think. Come on. There we go. Oh, I can hear it in the background. Gentlemen, you can't hear it because I actually took it off of, well, your side, but it's slowly kicking in there. This is Shake It. It's a remix from a good friend of mine here in Ottawa called Abe Van Dam. Abe, thank you very much for the outro music and for your support for the past 100 episodes. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your companionship and your support. It's always appreciated. And brother, thank you very much for your company. You always have a home here and a little bit of family north of the border. And for all of you who are, I'm going to look at the camera, for all of you who are out there in your own special way supporting, don't forget to check out patreon.com/Den of Lore. Subscribe, hit the bell, go to any number of subscription podcast channels. We're all on there. And most of all, don't forget to keep your decanter full and a couple of ice cubes at hand, just in case you want to be able to take the edge off that scotch. My name is Chris George Zuger, and next week on the program, we are actually not even Thursday. We've got Hugh Newman and J.J. Amesworth. We're going to be talking about giants with one of the masters out there and megalithomania.
I think it.
So I hope you can all join us as well as next week. Don't forget, on Monday or Tuesday, we're going to have Spiros Milaris. We're going to be talking about how to spot a fake alien. That's going to be our masterclass for July. I can't wait for that one. Spiros is always a great guy. You may remember him from the Fox Alien Autopsy. We got him live in studio once again for all of your questions. My name is Chris George Zuger. Have yourself a wonderful evening.